This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Again. Can I welcome everyone to the Police and Crime Committee meeting. This morning we will be holding a panel discussion on preventing violence and protecting young people in London. Please can you make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. And can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Duval, for whom Assembly Member McCartney is attending as a substitute, and Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, and thank you, Assembly Member McCartney, for joining us. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare?
Yes, Chair. Can I just declare, because it's not on the papers, that I'm Statutory Deputy Mayor and also Deputy Mayor for Children and Families. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 20th of September 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record? Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? So, we now move on to our main item of business, and where we will be discussing preventing violence and protecting young people. And I would like to welcome our first panel of guests. So we have Commander Kevin Southworth, who is Head of Public Protection with the Metropolitan Police Service. Welcome. We have Will Balakrishnan, who is Director of Commissioning and Partnerships at MOPAC. Welcome. We have Jodie Beck, who is Policy and Campaigns Officer at Liberty Human Rights. We have Pauline Daniyan, who is Chief Executive of London Youth. And we have Anthony King, who is Chairman of MyEnds. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for making it here to City Hall. So we're going to start with our first question, which is a question that we put to the panel that we had at our previous meeting, which is about the phrase serious youth violence. And the young people from the Young People's Action Group had some very strong views about how to talk about young people affected by violence. So we're just interested to know what the phrase serious youth violence means to you. So I don't know which end shall we... Given Anthony's just come in, I'm going to start at the other end. So Kevin.
Good morning, Chair and panel. Thank you for having us here today. And from a policing perspective, I should say that serious youth violence, it means something quite specific. As colleagues and partners around here will know, we tend to track our crimes through our crime data systems, and one of the categories is indeed that, SYV, serious youth violence. So as a term, it encompasses a basket of crimes which range from murder and manslaughter right the way down to some driving offences, death by dangerous driving, causing death by careless driving, things that you might not necessarily think of in that conventional sense of serious youth violence. So it is a very broad basket of crimes for most serious violence and serious youth violence. And that's what that term means to us from a policing perspective in terms of how we calculate the crime types in a certain area. I think as a phrase, it's not something that we overutilise within policing, because we tend to focus more on other more precise proxy measures for crime types. So for instance, we will tend to track our knife injury violence under 25 far more closely, because that's a more specific measure of exactly knife injury violence against young people, which I know is a concern for us all. Whereas SYV, as we term it, is a much wider basket of crimes. But just for everyone's hopeful clarity, that's what that term actually means within a policing performance statistical context, if that helps, Chair.
That's very helpful indeed. Thank you, and very, very clear. Will?
Well, I mean, unsurprisingly, a somewhat similar answer. But I think it's we, for example, in our problem profile, which MOPAC published on violence, gangs and young people, we use a similar definition of serious youth violence as, victims of the most serious violence, aged between 1 and 24 years age at the time of the offence. And most serious offences is described in a very similar way to the way Kevin did it. That's obviously when we're looking at the profile, though. I thought the discussion was really interesting at the last PCC, because when we're talking to young people or when we're dealing with young people, we actually try to use a similar phrase, affected by violence. also recognising the sort of overlaps between being a victim, being an offender, other things in young people's lives. So I think it's important that when we're looking at statistics or when we're having a conversation about the problem, these can be two different types of language.
Thank you. Jodie.
Thank you for that question, and thanks for having me. So we at Liberty use that term quite critically. So firstly, whilst being absolutely unequivocal in saying that, you know, any level of harm or violence affecting young people is a tragedy and that it demands a response, we know that, you know, terms like serious youth violence are really stigmatising and demonising, and I think that came out in the panel that you held with young people, and the consequences of that language are what really counts. And when creating our Holding Our Own guide, which kind of looked at this issue of, you know, what is referred to as serious youth violence, the young people we co-created that with showed us and told us how terms like serious youth violence leads to the presentation of violence as endemic to young people, and it often misses the violence and harm that is inflicted upon young people through whether that's a policing and enforcement-led approach to violence, or kind of this uncoupling of violence that happens with the broader systemic picture. And so we really go into this issue looking at that critically and opting for terms like violence affecting young people.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Pauline.
Hello. I wouldn't disagree with what my colleagues have said, and just reading through the comments from the previous session as well. We've consulted and spoken with the young people on our youth board and with the youth workers across our network, and the title serious youth violence, as was explained at the beginning, very much comes from that statistical data gathering, and when it makes its way into the everyday use, it can stigmatise young people. And so we very much like to take the approach being youth-led, where it's more about young people affected by violence, because it's really interwoven in terms of perpetrators and victims, and just those young people who witness it, who are just in the vicinity or suffering quite traumatic experiences and fear just by the news stories and things that they hear. So it's very wide-ranging when you think the impact that the title and crime has on young people, and we very much like to break it down and really try to come from that child-centred approach, taking it from that young person's perspective in terms of the impact on them. So very much would be in the camp around young people affected by violence is the view we take.
Thank you. Anthony.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, everybody. This is a conversation that we always have with our young people currently. We're in a borough that is highly affected by serious youth violence, with our stats going up, especially around knife crime, the London Borough of Croydon. And when we sit down and speak to a cohort of our young people about the term serious youth violence, they see the world from a complete different perspective than the narratives that are shared. I would agree with my police colleagues in terms of the definitions due to data. However, our young people, we need to look at it from the perspective of violence affecting young people. Many of our young people have become desensitised to the term serious youth violence because it's their everyday norm and their everyday reality. So we would go with the new narrative of violence affecting young people, and what that means for the young people is those that they've observed being impacted by serious youth violence, vicarious traumas and things like that, and also taking into account what is their now acceptable experience. They now see it as this is our norm. This is our norm. Violence is the norm. We expect that as we leave for school, return home from school, to see some type of violence. But I would more go with the narrative of violence affecting young people versus that common trend of term serious youth violence. It's such a wide terminology, but it needs to be honed into the experience of that young person or of young people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I think that's been very clear from all of you, and I think we've sort of picked up the kind of the data definition that the Met uses, and that's really useful to understand that, but also to understand the kind of the breadth of people affected. I mean, the witnesses as well as people perpetrating or experiencing actual violence. So, which does make that term affected by violence seem much more appropriate if you're trying to work with young people and actually try and kind of prevent this violence from happening in the first place. Sean, you wanted to...
Very small.
Just briefly.
It seemed like your definition is fairly shared. You don't like the term. Do you think what's driven your change in the use of the term is more about the effect it has on victims and not perpetrators? Because to a layperson, it would look like you've placed victims and perpetrators almost together, whereas serious youth violence, because it came from a sort of enforcement point, was saying, well, these people inflict violence. So are you saying that you are looking at all young people as both victim and perpetrator, or do you think this brings them too close together? I'll go to Anthony and Pauline.
Good to see you again, Lord Bailey.
Good to see you.
Really good to see you. And I'd like to look at the term serious youth violence. It literally pulls everybody into the same cocktail of conversation, so the victim and the perpetrator. When you consider, you've been in our borough and you're aware that we've worked with both victims and sadly the families of the perpetrator and the siblings of those impacted by serious youth violence. And sadly, somehow they get pulled into the same cocktail of the narrative serious youth violence. But when you change the narrative to violence against young people, it doesn't pull everybody into the same cocktail, if that makes sense. It doesn't pull everybody into the same, or tarnish everybody with the same brush. You've got perpetrators that have the label serious, being involved in serious youth violence, and victims seriously affected because of serious youth violence. But if we go with the narrative of violence against young people, or we literally change it slightly, it does give more of a definition. But that's just my view. It gives more of a definition, and it doesn't pull everybody or tarnish everybody with the same narrative.
Okay. I would just add, it depends on what we're looking at. So if we're looking to count the numbers, then, you know, the Met Police have their definition and they're counting the numbers of crime. But if we are coming from the perspective of how do we hold and support young people, you may well have a young person who's perpetrated crime. If you start to look at the data, you look at the profile behind those young people, very often they've been affected by crime at some point, they've witnessed crime at some point. And what we have to try not to do is to put young people, and somebody said it in one of the sessions before, I almost want to introduce children and young people, because sometimes we forget we're talking about children here. And how do we ensure that we can support them, because they've got their whole life ahead of them for something that's happened in their childhood. And so whilst there are different categories of children and young people, those who are perpetrators, those who are victims, those who have witnessed, they all need an element of support to ensure that they can enjoy a full life, even after they may have served a crime or they're punished for the crime. They still have their whole life ahead of them. And there's something about our society where we've got to be reminded, how do we ensure that we put the right things in place to support our children and young people to get through life? In some boroughs, it's successfully live into adulthood and have a prosperous life as well. So it's just because there's different elements to it, why I think we kind of come from that angle.
Okay. Thank you, Jade.
Which has actually brought us into the next question. Did you want to come in on that?
If I may, Chair, just
yes,
for a second, just to help with Lord Bailey's question as well, and for my colleagues on the panel, it'll sound quite anomalous, this, but one of the other reasons that we tend to focus on other proxy measures a little more than serious youth violence in policing is actually SYV is actually purely from a policing performance perspective, is actually a victim count. So it counts the number of victims affected as opposed to offenders. So whilst there will be offences of serious youth violence, it's a victim count, which can lead to some statistical anomalies, because if you have multiple victims in many cases, even if they're just witnesses who suffered psychological injury, then of course it can suddenly amplify your rates. So in terms of a good gauge of what is a serious crime affecting young people from a policing perspective, it can lead to some quite misleading figures depending on how many victims there have been in a situation. So I only say it just for completeness, really, but it doesn't detract from anything that my peers are saying. Yeah, no, that's really really interesting in terms of actually looking at the data, and useful that you recognise that.
So the next question is about the balance between the work going on in London to tackle the underlying causes of violence and the enforcement approach, so that kind of balance between enforcement and tackling the things that can lead to violence. And yes, sort of what do you feel about the balance going on in London? Now, who wants to answer that first? Yes.
Certainly happy to lead off, Chair, but I'm sure my colleagues will have plenty to say as well. Will, did you want to? No.
I'll come next.
Okay. I mean, in terms of that balance, in terms of what we're trying to do to tackle knife crime, there's, as usual, as colleagues will be aware of many initiatives we have, some fairly exhaustive things going on around all efforts to tackle knife crime in all of its forms. So if you take Operation Sceptre, which has been running for some more than a decade now, since I was at Trident myself many years ago, that's been a weekly sort of stint of action, everything in terms of raising education and awareness of the hazards of carrying knives, right the way through to trying to minimise the amounts of knives in circulation. That runs in 2 weeks' time. It actually commences on the 13th of November. So again, another great initiative which has stood the test of time in terms of helping to reduce the amount of knives out there in circulation and trying to educate young people about the hazards of carrying knives in our communities. And at the same time, that comes against the backdrop of frankly, the calendar of things that go on around knife crime prevention. So that would include, of course, our autumn nights plans, which all BCUs have in place in order to be ready for the dark nights now they're arriving with us in the autumn. So increased patrols in what we know are our key violence areas, as indicated by our data, so that we can try and make sure we have that presence there to reassure young people that the police are there if they need us. And then, of course, this extends right the way across to the work of our Safer Schools offices in school settings. I'm afraid there's almost too much to list, really, in many respects, but I wouldn't want to
we'll be coming to Safer Schools a bit later in the meeting. So
certainly. I just thought I'd get the ball rolling with that anyway.
Will.
Thanks. I suppose I just want to say, obviously at the Mayoralty we have a public health approach to reducing violence in London, and I think actually what that means is that both tackling the underlying causes and enforcement are part of that approach. So, I mean, if I characterise that from a sort of where MOPAC, for example, invests in services, you know, we're more in what you call the sort of tertiary space in a public health approach. I know that's a bit wordy, but, you know, this is the sort of framework we're in. I suppose what that means is making sure that the ongoing problem is well managed to avoid crises and reduce the harmful consequences. So that means there is some acceptance that there are victims and there are perpetrators. And, you know, solely tackling the causes, you know, would sort of leave them. And I think it's really interesting because there's so much crossover. So, for example, one of the most successful services MOPAC commissions in that tertiary space is the London Gang Exit Programme. And for that, we see that people on that programme have both a statistically significant reduction in violent offending, but also a statistically significant reduction in victimisation. So I think it's important to see those overlaps when we're talking about those children and young people.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Jodie.
I think this question relates really well to the first, in terms of Liberty's work really looked at how this kind of term serious youth violence can actually be a dragnet for young people, kind of needlessly dragging young people into the criminal justice system. And in that respect, we would say that the balance is quite skewed towards that enforcement and policing-led approach. And there's currently not enough being done to tackle the root causes, the main one of which is poverty, which I know has come out quite strongly in the previous panels to this inquiry. And it's really about getting to the root of, you know, what is it like to grow up as a young person in London today? It's quite frankly really difficult. You know, we've got the second highest rate of poverty in England. Over 2 million people can't afford basic food and toiletries. There are multiple boroughs across London where, you know, families are in poverty after paying their housing costs. We need to look at the bigger picture here and look at the bigger picture around how growing up in poverty impacts young people. It's deeply stigmatising. It cuts off your access to basic things like whether it's, you know, getting the bus to see your friends or, you know, having different experiences. If violence prevention takes up the majority of the space for work and for funding projects with young people, we miss that broader scope of the broader experience of what it's like to be a young person in London today, outside of violence when it happens, which, whilst we need to take that really, really seriously, and one life lost is quite frankly one too many, that is still a very small number of young people relative to young people across London. So we would say that, yeah, we need to look at that bigger picture.
Thank you. Pauline.
It's an interesting one because we're looking at the balance between enforcement and then tackling the issues. And early intervention is always a key area to kind of look at. But just as my colleague has said, we've also got to, particularly here in London, look at the context in which we're living in as well, and the young people that makes up the capital, and some of the underlying issues that are affecting young people. And a lot of the data and statistics will show you in terms of the disproportionality of different communities that will get caught up in a lot of the statistics and be brought into, you know, that net that kind of captures all young people. And the reason why I say that is because there is that stigma, there is that element of young people having this sense of fear that something's going to happen, and therefore they may well carry a knife because they're almost trying to protect themselves or prevent something. And so how do we kind of tackle that in a way to almost give that sense of safety? You know, because that's really what's missing. A sense of trust is gone, and a sense of safety. And who is it that young people are going to trust? And so just really speaking to the work that we do at London Youth, we're a membership organisation. Over 600 youth organisations across London are in the network, and they do a range of different work, from really small grassroots organisations to larger organisations. And there, a key element there in youth work and the role that the youth sector can play is about a person that a young person can trust outside of that formal education system, outside of the family. Many young people, particularly where they're dealing with a lot of structural inequalities and poverty and so forth, are very often looking to see who can they trust. And this is where the youth sector plays a really vital role. I know the programme in terms of the London Gang Exit programme. There are a range of other programmes that are being delivered across the capital that are really where you've got youth workers investing the time to create that trust, to allow young people to put the shoulders down, and ultimately, you know, if those that are carrying weapons, to make the case that that's not the best thing to do. It takes time. It takes that investment in time in a young person's life, and for a young person to feel that they can trust you, that you understand where they're coming from, you understand why they've got their shoulders up, why they're carrying that fear. And so we have to really look at what is working well in across different boroughs, and really put that investment there so that we can do that intervention alongside the enforcement, because nobody's saying that we mustn't do enforcement. We have to do enforcement to really have a function in society, but we've also got to tackle some of the underlying issues as well, where we've got the younger generations coming up where the levels of trust is so low, and it doesn't bode well for the future. And part of the role that we play, we've got to be able to work together with the various agencies and ensure that young people can start to build up that trust, so that we can be sure that we are supporting them into a really fulfilling future and career. So I think that's really vitally important.
Thank you. Very strong case for trust. Anthony.
Question is, how do I take over from that?
You don't have to, because there'll be lots more. There's lots of questions coming.
Absolutely, but I think it's very key to note that with our borough, with our local authority, we had the highest number of teenage murders succinctly for a number of years. And it took for some radical shifts. First of all, it would be wrong of me not to mention the significant impact through investment of MOPAC and the Met Police in our borough, in a borough that sadly faced bankruptcy, meaning a reduction in youth services. But MOPAC stepped up extensively, the Met Police stepped up, and the community stepped up to deal with the challenges that we face in our borough. With 22 months of no teenage murder until sadly the recent passing of Eliane, it showed the power of coming together, working together and building trust and confidence. We took the children, we don't like the term at risk, but we took the children with the most challenges, significant challenges, done extensive work through the MyEnds project, and realised that it wasn't only young people that we were dealing with, Sean, but it was also their families. So we're not only dealing with challenging backgrounds of children, but we realised that the homes were broken extensively. It was going back to old-fashioned youth work, going back to old-fashioned working with the teachers, bringing whoever's left of parents into conversations. We started to establish a meeting where we brought the borough commanders unit into the same room as families, into the same room as politicians, into the same room as head teachers, and grassroots organisations to come together and pull together to see a reduction in serious youth violence. We also then got our young people that have sadly been through the criminal justice system and with challenges. We started to employ them to train the Met Police on how to police their communities with cultural competency and understanding how to police their communities. And it was the results of it is now we've got 4 young people that have applied to work for the Met Police, whether it's through social media and different routes. Some of them don't want to walk the streets and do stuff and searches. However, these young people are now working with the Met Police extensively and doing fantastic work. I'm talking 25 to 30 young children and young people, 14, 15, 16-year-olds from disadvantaged backgrounds. We've got former children that were looked after that are now training the Met Police and being paid to do it at the Warren. And they're building fantastic relationships, and you can see in the community when police officers are walking through the streets of Croydon, the same young people that hated the Met Police are shaking hands with the Met Police. So we are seeing trust and confidence built, and also there's that accessibility from our local BCU. Parents have access to the BCU, young people have access to the BCU, and the head teachers have access to the BCU. And because of that collegiality and camaraderie, we are seeing a change, and we are seeing relationships forming in our borough. And it's fantastic. But the biggest challenge we have is how long does investment stretch? We can't deal with only micro-funding of 2 years and 3 years. We need to look at generational funding. We need to look at 5 and 10 years. How can this be not only continued, but how can it be replicated in other boroughs where we can get faith groups, the Met Police, teachers, young people in the same room on a weekly basis to bring about a change in the community? But the facts and the results of it is when you go 22 months with only 1 teenage murder, and sadly that teenage murder, it wasn't involved in any gang activity, but 22 months of no teenage murder, that shows the power of working together and collegiality.
Mm-hmm. So partnership,
it's
the
definitely
power of partnership
working and investment, and it can't only be micro investment of 6 months to a year. It's got to be 5, 10 years with a plan of seeing a change in the long haul.
Mm-hmm. So a strong case for sustained investment. Kevin, I just wondered, in terms of these young people that Anthony just described working with the Met, do you think having that kind of engagement with young people for Met officers, do you think that's changing the way people work, the way the Met makes decisions?
Thanks, Chair. I think extraordinarily so, and thanks to Anthony and all colleagues down at Croydon for all that they've done there to make that a reality, because that's what it relies on, isn't it? That goodwill and that interworking between police and community and young people alike. And couldn't agree more with everything that my colleagues here have said. And I forgot to mention before in my earlier answer to this question that, of course, under the new Met for London, we are currently, and I'm leading on this, formulating a new child-first strategy specifically to ensure that we try to engender that cultural competence that everyone's rightly talked about here today, right across our workforce, officers, staff, frontline call handlers, so that in every instance, all of our employees and our partners as well, we make sure that we see the child first rather than anything else. So even if we're looking at someone who is guilty of potentially a serious crime, ultimately we're prepared to look at it from the point of view that actually why have they found themselves in this situation? Is it that they've had a very disadvantaged or exceptionally challenging, as Anthony rightly says, upbringing or lived experience that's led them to this place? Why are they carrying that knife? And the child-first approach, which many of our colleagues at MOPAC have embraced previously, it's all about exactly that, seeing the child in the round as a child first and foremost. Even if we end up having to go down the enforcement route, we come at it from that rather more enlightened point of view, hopefully. That'll take time to indoctrinate and to press through the culture of the organisation, but the great work that Anthony's talking about in Croydon is, of course, a fantastic first step in that, isn't it? An exemplar, really, of where we want to be, where we've got children, young people so enthused about the relationship, they're actually joining up to help us train our own officers and staff and reciprocally do good in their own community, which has to be a force multiplier from my point of view as a police officer. So thanks again, and let's hope we can continue that momentum right the way across London.
Mm-hmm. Susan, you wanted to come in.
I'll be very, very quick. Anthony, I've heard about the work you do. I'd love to come down to Croydon and see it. And some of the things you're saying is fantastic. And cross-working always benefits everybody. Can I ask you, though, Pauline, I always hear that young people carry knives because they don't feel safe. And so, therefore, it's as a protection. But what flips then to make some of them literally maraud through the streets brandishing the knives, because that's do you know what I mean? We see too many clips, and I'm never happy at clips because you never see the beginning and the end bit, and that certainly is not helpful for the police in very many instances. But what takes a young person from thinking, right, I'm only going to carry it to make myself feel safer, to flipping and literally marauding through the streets with these great big knives? What do you know? What happens then? Because some of the things that we all see on the internet, there is no way they're carrying those knives to keep themselves safe. They are literally terrorising other people with it. So are there two separate sects of people? You're nodding. That's interesting.
I was going to say, I don't know if I can even answer that, because, you know, unless I go off and speak to young people who are brandishing knives, you know, it will just be an assumption. But all I would just say, you know, sometimes when we do see clips, that isn't the majority. It is a handful. So whilst we are talking about what do we do for those who are thinking that they're bad enough to take out a knife and go down the street, it's different to those who are feeling really fearful and trying to figure out, right, what do I do to keep safe and protect myself to step out. And what I would bring in there, you know, what's actually happening on the ground, it's really about a trusted adult coming alongside a young person to have a conversation to say, is that the right thing to do? Because almost showing somebody where that's going to lead to. So there is lots of work going on across London in youth settings where you've got youth workers trying to have that conversation with young people to try and prevent them from doing that. So I think that there is real merit in the role that a trusted adult can play in a young person's life, but I don't think I'm necessarily qualified to answer why they necessarily do that.
You know, you're right, Pauline, in many ways. There's two sad realities here. Number one, it's really sad that the majority of young people that I speak to that have been carrying knives, majority that I've spoken to, sadly, are from looked after backgrounds, from broken homes, walk with fear, walk with the notion of it could be me next, because they've observed what's happened to a friend of theirs. They're listening to, some have become so desensitized and just expect that another incident's going to happen that I might as well just carry something to protect myself. But there's something that I say publicly, and I'm looking at Lord Bailey because I'm sure culturally we'd understand that there was no way I could leave my house with an item that my mother hadn't purchased without her patting me down and saying, what are you leaving the house with? The challenge we've got is that when you're talking about knife crime in London, sadly, the majority is from my community, a community that reflects my hue, the black community. And sometimes we have challenges where I've called it out publicly that I'd recommend that parents stop and search their children before the Met Police have to. Sometimes it doesn't go down well, but I stand by it, that if a mother or a father can hug their child before they leave the house. I've called out care workers and said, look, if you're working in a children's home or if you're a foster carer, have that conversation before your child leaves the house. Check the bag. If you want to check that they've got the packed lunch, check that they haven't taken the bread knife or the bun knife from the kitchen. And it's having real conversations like that and asking members, yes, I will say it publicly, of the community that I represent to also speak out and encourage fellow members of the community, fellow family members, peers, etc. Speak to your children, check them before they leave their house, because we have a challenge here where the majority, when you look at the statistics of 2 years ago and you saw that it was 31 children, teenagers that lost their lives on the streets, the majority wasn't from the posh backgrounds of Fulham or Kensington. They were from disadvantaged backgrounds, and 26 of them were black.
Yeah.
I could be wrong statistically, please correct me, but the majority were black.
Yes.
And for me, we do need to have these conversations and not be afraid to have these conversations. Stop and search your child first. And young people also need to feel safe to have conversations. That's why I'm really supportive of what MOPAC's done with the mentors and getting extensive mentors out in the community. To have these conversations with young people, that if you carry a bladed article, these are the consequences of carrying a bladed article. We've had to encourage new Met recruits to have this dialogue with young people. When we train the new recruits, this is where the challenges lie. We're not employing police officers from London to police communities. when I'm training new recruits and I'm bringing the young people, we're asking these guys, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, new officers, where are you from? They're saying Sussex and the coastal areas. And they're having to police in a cauldron called Thornton Heath or Brixton. And they're 21, having to ask a gentleman who's 29 who there's a smell of cannabis in the vehicle to step out the vehicle. And then you've also got intergenerational traumas that play into it, which causes what would be perceived as aggression. So you've got to look at it you've got to go into the kernel of the challenges. But the biggest thing is the power of the conversation and encouraging conversations with young people. Don't carry a bladed article.
Okay, and also encourage more people from your community to join 100%. The police, because that's what we need, and I know the police are desperately trying to do that. And it's good to hear you speak out. I have tried to speak out, but I am misunderstood, so I have to keep quiet, which is a great shame, because the community does need help. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Hall. Assembly Member Ahmed, bringing you in now.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. This committee was told that research by the Wave Trust found that the root causes of violence are in the experiences of children and in the first 3 years of their lives. I'd like to ask you all, is enough work being done in London on early years prevention? What more is needed, and who should be responsible for delivering it? Commander Southworth, I wonder if we could start with you.
Thank you very much. And I think early years has been recognised for some time now as being that formative phase, hasn't it, where so many people's imprinting happens and they can understand the world through those early experiences. I'm not a psychologist and I won't pretend to be, of course, I'm a police officer, but trauma-informed policing has become very much a popular phrase within our world, because trying to understand the impact on children and young people as they come through those difficult experiences and become the young people they're then going to be is pivotal to everything we said before about adopting a truly child-first approach to what we hope to achieve, not just from a policing perspective, but with our partners. Obviously, at those ages, that's well before they're going to come into contact, I would hope, with my colleagues in my service, because, of course, they're well below the age of any sort of criminal culpability at that age. But ultimately, of course, that doesn't change the fact that they could be embarking on a life path which leads them into contact with us further down the line. So I absolutely commend the approach. How we do that, of course, is best led through our partners, through our close work with social services and others, where I think we have a really signal role to play in this in policing, is to work with our multi-agency safeguarding hubs, is to make sure we have the most coherent possible approach to looking at our data sets so that we can work through the London Safeguarding Children partnerships that we have to try to best use data to identify those families and those children and young people who may be at most risk of falling into that potential dangerous lifestyle that we don't want them to, where they're then going to come into contact with police, or worse still, they're going to come into contact with violent members of their own community, or indeed inflict violence themselves, which leads us back to where we are today. So completely commend the approach. I think there's a much wider role for us to play with our partners in this, because of course at those age brackets they're significantly before the point at which we'd expect normally to intervene as police, but very much fulsomely in support of what we can do together in this, and as per the great work spoken about earlier.
Thank you. Ms Daniyan.
Hi there. I'm probably going to say the problem isn't new. And if we kind of go back quite a few years, I've been in the sector a while now, more on the commissioning front, when there was more investment. And there was more investment in family centres, there were more investment in children's centres. But that investment has gone. But the problem is here, and then we're trying to tackle a problem that we stopped investing in the support for families. Now we're in a time where families are really, really struggling, so they've got even less time in some households to really give that holding the child, patting down the child. And so very many children are left to their own devices. So if we really are serious about, and I like that, child first, children, let's keep saying it, children, because I don't want to be desensitised to thinking, young people. I know young people like to be referred to as young people, I totally get it. But as adults, we've got to remember they're children. So we've got to go back to early years, and we've got to see the investment in early years. We've got to see the investment in ensuring that families get the support they need. Many families really need support just in terms of just some of the basic skills as well. And we used to invest in it. Investment it's really difficult. I'm not going to shy away from that. You know, local authorities have had to make really difficult decisions. Government have had to make difficult decisions. But the impact of that has been our communities. The impact has been our young people. And so we have to make a choice. Where are we going to invest? Are we going to invest at the far end where crime's happening? Or are we going to ensure that we're investing sufficient early on with families and young people, spaces for young people to go? A lot of research shows, you know, I know there's a survey from Partnership for Young London. We did one a few years ago before the lockdown, where young people are looking for a safe space to go. You know, from a very young age. I was very fortunate last Friday in half term to be at a basketball tournament. You know, I never really get to go out that much, but I spent the day in a sports hall where it was a 3x3 basketball, and you had children as young as 7 right the way up to 19, different categories, doing different competitions, and you kind of think, it's half term. Many families are challenged in terms of how to not only just feed their children, but provide activities for their children, and we've got to really invest in the right spaces, and we can't close our eyes to it as adults, you know, as decision makers, and we've got to ensure that in each area there is the provision there for young people of all ages. And so it's vitally important that that investment, I think, goes in at the early age to ensure that those young people get the support they need where they are dealing with trauma, but just a safe space to go, because a safe space is really, really vitally important at all ages.
Thank you. And thank you for making that correlation between investing early and then not having to deal with issues afterwards. And any economically competent government would surely understand that that is where we need to make our investment. Thank you very much. Mr. King.
For me, it's really important to invest in an earlier setting. One of the things we realised is that we were having challenges with children. We were looking over 2018, just before the pandemic, and we were noticing that many of our children that were involved in, sorry to use this term, serious youth crime, and looking at it from an early years perspective, carrying knives into school, etc., we realised that many of the children didn't have anything to eat before they came into school. Simple things like no breakfast. So there's 5 or 6 schools in our local area that started to give our children porridge and toast for free. The children didn't have to pay for it. We were noticing that it was the children from the disadvantaged backgrounds that were going up for seconds, thirds, wanting more. They were actually arriving into school earlier. This took into account that we had to look at it from the perspective of, when we looked at some of the challenges that we had with our 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, we were noticing that after school they could only afford chicken and chips. And that would be their last meal until first thing in the morning, where the schools were able to now give them porridge to raise their sugar levels, to help them to understand that they can now thrive in a class because they've had something to eat in the morning. Simple things like having breakfast. Early investment, we're talking about 4-year-olds who have been privy and have seen things, seen brothers being arrested, seen family members taken out of the home. This has an amazing impact on our children, up to the extent that yesterday I was with one of the head teachers, from one of our local head teachers of an infant school in Croydon, just got an Ofsted outstanding. And when she took over the school, one of the biggest challenges she had was that children had nothing to eat. They'd come in like they're gangsters and they were only 4 or 5. Their languages, you had 7-year-olds with highly sexualised behaviour. And she was like, I've come into a school and I've had to take over a school where children needed intervention. And she's been screaming out for the last couple of years, we need intervention from an early stage. We were putting projects in secondary schools to try and deal with knife crime, deal with serious youth violence, forgetting that we've got 6 and 7-year-olds that are taking knives into school and getting angry and over-violent in classes. And some of the issues were linked to the fact that their sugar levels were low in the morning, and some was linked to some of the traumas that they've seen at home. Dad murdered. I can't go into it, but we're actually dealing with a high-profile issue in our local area right now, so significant that we've had to call an emergency meeting during half-term because we've got an 11-year-old child who's not knowing whether his father's going to return home, and all of the news he's getting is on the news. He's finding out on the news what's happening with his father. All of these are major concerns. But if there's interventions and investments from an earlier settings, some of our children, as they're emerging into secondary school, won't have to deal with some of the challenges. We have this issue at the moment that 9-year-olds, as they're getting ready for secondary education, are starting to deliver that. They're starting to develop that fear that, hold on, I'm going to be travelling on a bus on my own, I need to carry protection. And because you've also got uncle and grandfather that's had poor relationships with the Met Police, So they've got a negative narrative. And all of this is poured on a 9, 10-year-old. So when a 9 or 10-year-old needs to have a conversation with a police officer due to concerns, they won't because of the traumas that they've heard. So we need that earlier investment. It's got to be from 2, it's got to be from 3, it's got to be a 4-year-old. Sit them down from early, invest in it. Let's get the family centres back on. Let's get our children having breakfast. That's why I'm admiring the fact that lunch is provided for children, because these are the kids that are going out and hanging outside chicken and chip shops where drug dealers are pouring into them, buying them trainers that mummy can't afford. So there does need to be that early years intervention.
So I assume that you would therefore agree with a policy initiative that sets up breakfast for every primary school child in this country? Every child should have breakfast to raise their sugar level, that they should be able to sit down in a class in the morning and thrive. Some of the biggest challenges we have is because children, mum has to leave for work. Due to deprivation, mum has to leave for work. If she's a carer, she has to leave for work 6 o'clock in the morning to start a shift at 7 o'clock. At that time, you've got an 11-year-old who's got secondary school who's taking their younger sibling to school with no breakfast. How do we expect that child to thrive? And if their sugar level is low and somebody irritates them, they're only going to act out what Big Brother is showing them. So for me, you're right, we have to go ahead with a policy that ensures that every child, number one, if we're talking about investment into early years, let's start with making sure that children have something to eat in the morning, and that they've got a facility to go to where there is trained professionals, where they can have conversations, express their fears and concerns. And back in the day, we had a local Bobby. We need to go back to that level of investment. Thank you. And as my colleagues are saying, we did have that. It was called Sure Start, and unfortunately it's been cut to the bone.
Absolutely.
An internationally lauded initiative that came from this country in the last Labour government was cut to the bone and would have dealt with all the issues that both of you have spoken about. Thank you. Ms. Beck.
I think I'd echo some of what my colleagues on the panel have said. Throughout the course of creating the Holding Our Own campaign, we did extensive messaging research which involved kind of looking at serious case reviews. So when a young person has died, has been killed, and they track the life of that young person, and so often we were reading the recurring themes. Actually, when young people are born, what are the institutions in the community that are there for them, that can support them and their families? And all too often they just weren't there. And so I'd really agree, early years support is a crucial part of this picture. But also it kind of chimes with a point I made earlier about, investing in interventions and in support is really important, but if we leave the broader, systemic and structural picture untapped, so if we don't look at the welfare system to make sure that people have what they need, to ensure that there's an adequate social safety net that means that everybody can afford the essentials, then we'll only end up having services in the community that are shock absorbers for people in crisis, rather than just being there when people need support before they get to a crisis point.
Thank you, Mr. Balakrishnan.
Well, I'm not sure what more I can add really, other than to say, by focusing on sort of early intervention, we can't think that there aren't people who've already crossed that line and already crossed that Rubicon. I think that's why a public health approach is really helpful, because we have to work with society as a whole. So whilst I think there's a really strong evidence base for the points in a child's life and journey where interventions have the most value, back when local government had a bit more money to do early help systems, I think we really kind of understood how to bring partners together around that. Obviously, the Mayor and the VRU are putting some of those things back, particularly things like children missing education or, other things which we call, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I think the evidence base is really strong. I think, though, what makes the difference is some of the things, Anthony, you were talking about earlier, which is we're doing this in consort, we're doing this in partnership, we're doing it with communities, and we're seeing it as a whole, and we're seeing all the agencies that are in a child's life, in that family's life, and we're trying to put that together in a way that makes the most sense. So, yeah, I suppose that's what I'd say.
Thank you. To what extent can Excuse me, I'm in the process of losing my voice. My family are absolutely delighted.
Marina, could I just add a point here? I think we need to make the answers a bit briefer because we're still very much at the beginning of the meeting and we've got a lot to get through. So if answers could be a little briefer, that would be really helpful. Keep going.
Thank you, Chair, who is not losing her voice. To what extent can the Met address the root causes of violence and protect young people? Ms Daniyan, could you start, please?
So to what extent can the Met address the root causes of violence? I think the new strategy in terms of child first is a really good starting point because it is about having the child, the young person at the centre, understanding them, understanding some of the challenges, some of the barriers that they face, and so that they met really in terms of what we've heard, in terms of the training that goes into place, so that particularly where they're policing different communities, that there is that understanding of the communities, there's that understanding amongst the officers around cultural competency, and we can hear, in some areas it's actually happening. So it's a question of then how can you replicate that in different boroughs and in different areas. So some of the root causes, I think it really is about being in communities and speaking to communities, and I'll come back to what I said before in terms of trust, because we are hearing we are hearing success stories where the police are able to work effectively within communities, and how can that be replicated? And I think it's really for the Met Police to really understand and take the time to come down and sit alongside communities, really learn from communities, so that we can kind of see more of the good practice where communities are saying, yeah, that's a job, a career that I want to go into. So I think it's a really good example that we've actually heard. So that's probably what I'd say in that regard.
Thank you. Mr. Balakrishnan.
Well, I think there's two things really, isn't there? There's one what the Met does operationally and one what they do themselves, and I'll probably speak more about the latter than the former. But I think trust and confidence is really important, and I think trust and confidence that young people have in the police is one of the key root causes, I think, in London. And I think MOPAC, through the work we've done, there's a youth survey that I recommend you all look at, which has just been published, but we sort of understand what's going to have the biggest causality to young people having trust and confidence. And it's feeling that the police engage well with communities, treat everybody fairly, and are effective. There's a really effective for both trust and confidence. For confidence, perceptions of personal security, fear of crime, local crime problems, police visibility, feeling well informed about what police are doing are really important. For trust, accountability is really important, and that includes feeling the police are held accountable for their actions, feeling they reflect the public in terms of morality and the wider population, and feeling the police deal with complaints fairly. I think those are all things that are in the police's gift. I think if the Met are successful in delivering New Met for London, I think they'll do this.
Thank you, Mr. King.
I'm totally I'm pro the Met, very much so. They have, in our local BCU, Croydon, Sutton and Bromley, our borough commanders, the two borough commanders that we've had over the last 3 years have been exceptional. We've seen trust and confidence built in Croydon extensively. We meet every Friday in a room with 60 to 100 people. Lord Bailey has visited, and we have a fantastic conversation. We have direct access. I can speak on behalf of the young people who train them also. We are confident that if we can replicate this model across London, there'll be a change across London. It is being written as the Croydon model that we're actually writing at the moment extensively. But I would say it took for the Met to start from a position of humility, understanding that they didn't know it all and they needed the community to work in partnership. That's been our success model. We've done it for 3 years. We have seen an incredible result. Sir Mark has spent time with us as well to look at it, and it's reflected in the New Met for London. Even it was quoted in part of Louise Casey's report about the community involvement of Croydon and the Met Police. So I would just say we need to replicate that and have it pan-London, and we'll see a change across London. But it does start with the humility piece. and the humility part of the conversation.
Thank you. My final question is to the Met. Commander Southworth, what is the Met doing to tackle the root causes of violence affecting young people, including early intervention and prevention, and what more could you be doing?
Thank you, Assemblymember Ahmed, and welcome and echo all my peers' comments, but at the same time, to add to that specifically, I think the other areas that we can do more on to tackle violence, if I may, just at the back end of the spectrum, would be, we haven't yet talked about, other than Anthony's reference to it briefly before, our need to continue to target the criminal exploiters of children and young people. So whilst we must do all that we have rightly advocated today to protect young people themselves, the flip side to that from a policing and enforcement perspective is to make sure that we adequately use that intelligence and information from young people to identify those who are targeting them from the older age brackets who might be criminally exploiting them. It's been done very successfully in things like our approach to county lines. You'll be aware of Operation Orochi and the good work there we've done to try to decriminalise some of the youth who are affected by that crime phenomenon, while simultaneously better targeting the older members who are actually bringing them into that chaotic and dangerous place in the first place. So there's much we can do at that end of the spectrum, but mindful that your question was more aimed at the early intervention piece. In the spirit of being pithy, I'll try not to repeat what I said before, but there is a piece around how we best use our data through the local Safeguarding Children partnerships and through our MASHs to hone in and help focus not just our resources, but our partners' resources as well on those children who are most likely, I won't use the term at risk, recognising Anthony's feedback before, but those children who are at most danger perhaps of coming into contact with either other violent people or indeed to coming to notice themselves for acts of violence. Because as we know from everything we've discussed here today, sadly, if you're a child or young person who's, whether you're malnourished on your way to school, whether you're a victim or a witness of domestic abuse in the home, or whether you're subject to some of that awful exploitation I alluded to a moment ago, those are the children, young people we need to be proactively identifying, signposting to our partners and intervening with as early as we can so they don't get drawn down that dark road.
Thank you, and you weren't being pithy. Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry.
Very quickly. I'll be very brief. Good morning to all of you. A lot of what I was going to ask you has been covered. I think, Anthony, you started off by talking about victimisation and how children are treated. So my question is primarily to, well, commentary, I suppose, to you, but also to Commander Southworth. So I saw this morning some reporting of Sir Mark Rowley speaking to Trevor Phillips, and they were talking, I might misquote this, but they were talking about how if you're a black child, you're 13 times more likely to, I think it was either to be a victim of crime or to be stopped. It was in the context of basically, I guess I'm trying to get at, this conversation about serious youth violence has a racial dimension. And I would want to see that the police, which I think they're beginning to wake up to be fair, but the sector as a whole is taking into account that very important racial dimension. And I say that because I know something which has concerned me is that there is an approach, rightly, to children that are being groomed for sexual purposes and other sorts of purposes, but it doesn't seem to translate if somebody is, for example, a young black kid and they have seen all the things that you have talked about, they live in that household, they're not treated as a victim of grooming, they are treated as a likely perpetrator, and they come into contact with police in a way which means that they're on a path from the age of maybe 11 or 12 years old. So I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that very briefly, because I just think it's the bit of the inquiry so far for me that has been missing, and I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I would start by saying I think I would like to approach it from the point, and I hope I'm not out of turn here by saying this, but I think the Met needed to understand that they didn't know it all. And I want to start by saluting Sir Mark Rowley, because the first conversation I had with him is you need to really understand what's going on for the black community, and we need to have real conversations about it. We need to stop flirting and skirting around the side and have a real conversation as to why is it that Met officers find that it's okay to adultify a young person, number one, why it's okay to have a perception that a young person's aggressive when, as we go back to earlier's conversation, some young people, they're only responding a certain way because they haven't eaten in the morning, but you've got young officers saying that they're aggressive. So we have to have real conversations, and we have to continue the real conversations around helping the Met to understand, number one, some of the racial challenges and some of the challenges we have as a black community. And it's about having that dialogue and that conversation and not be afraid to have those conversations. Just like I put a statement out earlier, that, you know, my colleague, one of the panelists rightfully, one of the London Assembly members rightfully highlighted, well, I've tried to speak to the young people, but they wouldn't listen to me. Straight away, I understand where she's coming from, because sometimes the community will only hear their own community. But we've also got to educate the Met. And there's terminologies that I won't use, but some of the old hats, shall we say, some of those that have been in the job for 25, 30 years that feel that policing a certain way is acceptable, it's us having to re-educate them and train them at sergeant and inspector level, how to understand some of the challenges that the black community face, how to understand when a child is being groomed. They're not the aggressor, they're not the one going, they're being groomed. How it actually happens. Are you policing in the chicken and chip shops? Are you understanding why is it that a child whose mum's working as a support worker, how a child has a £300 pair of trainers? How do we approach that conversation? Are you deploying your officers to the right places, or are they only being responsive? Are they engaging and having conversation, or is it just enforcement? So these are the conversations that we need to explore and take it further and not shy away from it. And my pushback always is to the Met, invest in those conversations. Invest in it. Thank you.
Commander Southworth, I don't know if you wanted to...
Just to say, actively encourage all of that completely, and I think that cultural competence we alluded to before is central to what we need to achieve here, as Anthony rightly says, and engaging in those very necessary conversations. And Sir Mark has been clear in his view that he wants to see the strongest ever neighbourhoods as part of the new Met for London, including that increased engagement through school settings in particular, you know, where we can really see the benefits of that open conversation at an early stage. And the police officer in your community is that point of reassurance, that point of contact if you need them, as opposed to being some alternative interpretation of a threat or something similar, as colleagues have rightly alluded to. So we hope to continue to be that reassuring presence wherever we can be, and to engage in those conversations.
Thank you. We're really up against the clock, so Assembly Member Pigeon, if you can keep the pace up, that would be fantastic.
I'm absolutely going to be pacey. My questions are just for the Met, so Kevin, for you. You've already touched on it. You've talked about your new Child First strategy, and we've started to talk about this Child First approach. So can you update us where you are with this strategy? What's the timeline for it? We were told it was due out in November. Who have you been consulting with? How are young people involved in that? How are key partners and experts?
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. And yes, we're well advanced now with our drafting of this. We should have it out for consultation for November. I would say that in the spirit of that engagement, we want to make sure it's consulted on very widely indeed. Will and many partners, including directors of children's services, NGOs and others, have been part of some fairly substantial workshops that we've had on this. And then they've had breakout groups from that with more finite, discrete groups, whether you're DCSs, whether so on and so forth. But of course, with children and young people in particular, we've had a number of really productive workshops late into the evening at Scotland Yard. I was with some youngsters just the other night there, and we have another one, I think tomorrow night with Blotham Forest. We've had one with Hackney. We've got another one with young people from Croydon coming up soon. I don't know if you're invited, Anthony, but we'll make sure we are now. So we are making every effort we can to make sure we hear the voice of the child in this discussion, and young person, just to differentiate, of course, between those two. Because we tend to often forget, of course, that just because someone hits their 18th birthday doesn't mean we stop caring. And that's sometimes a hazard when we do talk about Child First, is that we can also forget that some very troubled and at-risk young people, sorry, I've used that expression, old habits, Anthony, I'm sorry, but very troubled young people can find themselves coming of age and still requiring our help and support. So that strategy is in now draft form. It has been consulted on widely with partners, NGOs and young people alike, and children, and ultimately we hope to have it out for consultation in November.
Okay, so what, by the end of November?
If I can say that, I will now, only because I still need to run it through my own management board and my own commissioner, of course.
So you've still got process, so it's not, because November is tomorrow, so it could be you're publishing it tomorrow, but you're talking later in November.
I think so, Caroline.
Okay, and will this new, and obviously it's a draft strategy because you're going to consult on it and then review it, will it pick up any of the issues that were raised in the latest HMI letter around protection of children, the concerns that were raised?
Yes, it will. And the strategy, whilst, as with most strategies, it will be quite a high-level document, but at the same time, the delivery plan behind it will go to the heart of all the issues that are signposted. There are many challenges which have fallen out of the most recent inspection that we've had by Her Majesty's Inspectorate. I've been very close to that piece of work, as you can imagine, and as the panel here will know, of course, we're responding to two accelerated causes of concern, in particular around missing young people and, of course, children at risk of exploitation. So we've already made some very solid steps, and writing back to Her Majesty's Inspectorate this week, in fact, around that very point. But that'll certainly be teased through as part of the strategy. And what I would say, if I may, is that much of that work, and Will and others who've worked with me really closely for this last year or so will attest, has been underway for some time. So it's not that we're slamming the stable door after the horse has bolted. Rather than a reaction to what we've heard from HMI, that's been a validation of the course we were already on. So we're trying to be proactive in this space where we can.
Okay, but let's just be clear. So you're going to be publishing, by the end of November, a draft strategy for consultation. Will you be publishing the delivery plan that goes alongside that, or is it just the high-level strategy?
Well, we have to finalise the strategy first, and then we can put the plan in behind, because, of course, we may get substantial feedback on the strategy, which causes us to change direction. So until I think I've got the strategy signed off, it's wrong to set the next step fully in train. But we are working on the delivery plan in the background.
Okay, lovely. And then the strategy is over what period?
The strategy, we haven't fixed the timescale. We're broadly suggesting it's a 5-year strategy, but to be frank, it's interminable, because this is about a generational reset in our relationship with children and young people. So I wouldn't want to put an end date on it in the nicest way. I'm hoping this will be something quite signal for us as a service.
Yeah. And it's a reset of the mindset, the culture within the police in terms of that victim blaming approach, which was in this latest letter only a few weeks ago. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pidgeon. That was very speedy. Assembly Member Devonish.
I'll try and beat that, Chair. Good morning. To the Met Commander, what are the main ways the Met engaged with young people, and how is it engaged with young Londoners in the development of the strategy? And I'm going to give you the second question as well. Sorry, apologies.
Question's already been asked. It's
sorry, apologies.
Next one, question 11.
Lucky I am moving on to 11 quickly then. What work is the Met doing to improve community engagement with young people to help build trust and confidence, please, Commander?
Certainly. The fantastic work done by our sort of over 300 Safer Schools officers through our Safer Schools partnership is an integral part to that, and as colleagues have rightly identified, that early engagement through school setting is absolutely imperative to maintain that early positive face of policing and encourage that reporting of things that they may need to share with us for their own safety. But more broadly than that, we have a very significant strand of our work which is all about community engagement, and of course we have the London Race Action Plan being formulated by my colleague Commander Wingrove as well, all of which involve heavy consultation with, across the community, different age strata, but including children and young people. And every BCU has its own engagement strategy as well with children and young people in their area, and we heard a great example of that before from Croydon, from Anthony, about the positive access that we now see, I hope, in most of our BCUs for children and young people and their families with their BCU commanders and their senior leadership teams, and of course through the joint work that we do with our partners through the London Safeguarding Children's Partnerships and YOS teams and so on and so forth. So it's a myriad picture of things that we do to try and ensure we capture all the views and the voice of the child everywhere.
Thank you. And to MOPAC, how well do you think the Met engages with young people, and what more specifically, please, Will, do you think they should be doing?
Thanks. I mean, I think it's a journey, isn't it? I think what Kevin's describing feels very different to where the Met maybe were a few years ago. Certainly, the feedback I'm getting from partners that work directly with young people is that they're welcoming the efforts that Kevin's doing. But what should they do more? I think Child First is a massive concept, and it comes out of youth justice. But what we're seeking to do is to apply it to the whole system. But in terms of specifically sort of engagement with children and young people, it's got to be ongoing. So it's got to be collaboration. So it's easy to consult. And I think consultation is a great first step. But what we know will lead to meaningful changes, some of those things I was talking about trust and confidence earlier, is it's ongoing, it's meaningful, and children and young people can see the changes and it's fed back to them. That's much more like it. It's active engagement. And that's what MOPAC really wants to see moving forward.
I won't ask you to measure it today, but I probably will next time. And to the rest of the panel, please, I'm going to give you the two questions. In your opinion, what should the Met's children and young people strategy focus on, and how important do you think the work on building and trusting community engagement is as part of the Met's children's and young people strategy, please? And we'll start with Anthony and move down, please.
Thank you very much. First things first, I'd like to have a conversation offline with the commander about the Children First strategy, because I'd like to have an assurance that it's taken into account children of colour. I'm aware historically that many strategies have been formed and many initiatives, great initiatives, but has it taken into account the fuller London? Has it taken into account a child that's looked after, that's been in a children's home for many years, or broken down home, foster care, etc. I'd like to just check on that, have that conversation, that dialogue about that, and see it reflected in a Children First strategy, because whatever happens, it needs to be palatable for the young people to engage with it. The young people need to understand the Children's First strategy and what the police are about to deliver. We need to be able to relate that to the young people. The second part, if I think I've got your second part of your question rightly, community engagement is going to be extremely key moving forward. Thankfully, I'm from a borough where we've had to be reliant on each other because there's no money in the borough, so we've had to be reliant on each other. But I would ask, and I'd put it back to the Met, that we want to see that same level of engagement pan-London, not just in Croydon and not with just the good news. I've got peers in Hackney, peers in Newham that would like to see the same level of relationship, the same level of community engagement, and I would like to actively see how you are encouraging your borough commanders to engage with their communities and faith groups and families. I'd like to see that actively pan-London. So I hope that answers the question.
Perfect, thank you. Pauline?
I think the thing that we would pull out is, and I think it's mentioned in the strategy, is the need for it to really be child-centred, really understanding where children and young people are at, that their voice is heard through it, understanding that the needs of different communities aren't all the same, so I'd echo what you say, and that there's evidence that the Met Police has the right training in place so that they can really engage with communities and build that trust over time. I think that's really, really vitally important. I know our youth board, a while back earlier this year, put some questions up to the Mayor, and it was really about, you know, what could the Met Police do better to engage and really respond to the needs of young people. And in particular, it was really looking at reassurances about a better understanding on the behalf of young people, that the Met understand them and understand their needs. And so I think that is really, really important, that the training is there as well. And really that there's a reflection that the Met understands the impacting of policing on young people and communities. And so whilst we've heard a really good example in terms of what's happening there in Croydon, which I really commend, it's, you know, what will that look like across all of London, and how long will something like that take to roll out? You know, what steps really will be made to come alongside different communities, different community groups, different families right across London to ensure that the same progress can be made across the capital?
Thank you. Jodie?
Thank you. So I think a Child First strategy, you know, if we're concerned with addressing the root causes and preventing violence, then the Met really has to think critically about what its role is in doing this. So, you know, if we're thinking about recent developments to stop the Met responding to mental health crisis, that's a really positive move. There are many root causes where the police shouldn't be first responders. If we're thinking about, you know, young people experiencing mental health distress, or young people in poverty, and thinking about the ways in which that kind of contributes to violence, then the Met really needs to think critically about its role. I think Liberty will kind of be watching for that strategy and kind of be interested to see what the substance is. There's a risk here that, you know, the language of Child First, the compassionate language of Child First, is essentially used over the top of really harmful police powers. I won't go into the detail of stop and search and police in schools, because I know we're going to come to that, but those are the ones that I'm thinking of. Also, we also need to recognise that community engagement with the police is really difficult. There are many young people who won't want to engage with the police on this strategy. Liberty worked with a number of young people of colour, particularly black young men accessing spaces like Art Against Knives in Barnet. You know, they talked about safety as something that the police were doing to protect other people against them, not something they deserved. And I think that's a real issue, and is not something that is necessarily going to be captured by community engagement on a MPS strategy. So we really need to think critically about that, and also the impact of institutional racism in the ways in which young people may or may not engage with those processes.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And that that perception of safety being something the police do to protect others against those young people is actually something that's really devastating to hear, that some young people are feeling that. So yes, sort of, again, it'll be very interesting to see what comes out in the strategy. Assembly Member Moema. Question 15.
Thank you. Thank you all. And just to say, I would echo the points made by Anthony in particular about wanting to make sure that the strategy is fully reflective of the diversity of London, particularly when it comes to race as well. But so this is a question for you all, but in the interest of time, you may not all want to answer it. So I would like to know, what's your organisation, what work is your organisation doing to support young people at risk of exclusion and to reduce the number of pupils excluded from school? Maybe we'll start with Commander Southworth. You did mention multi-agency work that you do.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Assembly Member Moema. The schools officers are obviously heavily involved in any multi-agency discussions that take place within educational settings that can hopefully prevent young people from being excluded from those settings. Equally, even when they are, we do have, I think it's 35 officers actually aligned to PRUs and similar institutions where, of course, children who slip out of mainstream schooling can then hopefully still benefit from at least some access to that reassuring figure of a police officer who can be there for them if they need them. There is then also the wider onus on us as a police service to work under our statutory partnerships with our LSCP partners to make sure that we convene strategy meetings in that very true sense of the word for any child in or out of school who's in some form of need or risk. And ultimately, when we must be prompt in calling those strats, as we call them, strategy meetings, sooner rather than later when we think we have young people who are at risk, because of course we can't just see them in the school setting. We need to view them in the round, don't we, and see what their challenges might be at home and in other areas of their lives as well. So yes, there's the role in schools to prevent everything from truancy to exclusion, which our schools officers are integral to, but then there's the multi-agency piece outside of the school setting, making sure that we convene timely and effective strategy meetings with partners to support them in all of their life.
Okay, before I move on to others, so I guess it would be helpful to kind of look at children excluded from school, primary and secondary, but also children separating that out from PRUs. So they are in education, but it's very different. I can't think of anybody who would willingly send their child to a PRU. But there is also a large and growing cohort of people, particularly post-pandemic, of children who just don't go to school anymore. And the role of the schools officers is contested. I can see the potential benefits if it was working very well, but they seem to be, I'm asking this in the context of the incident with Child Q happened in my constituency. They seem to be only requested by schools who maybe need an extra pair of hands. They are not uniformly applied in places where you might have drug taking. They're not necessarily in kind of like fancy parts of London, I'm thinking. You don't have school officers because they're not requested by schools. So I'm just wondering how you make that work better, given that in the context of a PRU, perhaps, you've got lots of people who their immediate response is to distrust the police, and there's a police officer in the school all the time, and there's already a feeling, well, they have already been excluded from school. And how is that helpful to kind of making sure that the system works properly?
Thank you. I hope I've understood your question correctly. The thrust of it seems to be, I think, a sense of your concern about disproportionality and the alignment of officers to perhaps the wrong school settings.
I'm worried about the strategy is written on paper, but as it lands on people, it doesn't land equitably, which is the point that was made. It lands hard on somebody who is in a PRU. It lands hard on somebody who's in one of the schools in my constituency, depending whether you're in Stoke Newington. It's very different to if you're in Homerton, maybe other parts of Waltham Forest. We had Project Zero here last month. It lands very differently depending if you're black, white, Asian. How are you going to make sure that it lands equitably across schools and for children?
And perhaps there's some feedback in there for me, I think, to take back to my colleague, Commander Harper, who leads on schools officers and how we array them across the city. So thank you for that. And I think it's a valid question, of course, to look at where we array our officers and make sure they're best used to support young people in educational settings, but at the same time to ensure that we're not purely responsive and therefore at risk of almost criminalising certain school children or indeed school settings simply by virtue of our very presence there. Perhaps some of that goes back to the heart of what the nature of the schools officer is, which is to be there as that point of contact and that reassurance, at which point, of course, making them really front and centre to our Child First strategy, where they're imbued with that cultural competence to avoid adultification and criminalisation of children. Just as a point of reassurance, something we haven't touched on today, but we have had some really positive commentary from HMI and others around the work that we've done to prevent criminalisation of children involved in youth-produced sexual imagery in school settings, because that's been a really good example of where we've used schools officers to embrace and mitigate a crime type, which if it were dealt with in another setting would actually end up with a criminal record. And of course it makes sure that young people who maybe has made a misstep with social media don't end up becoming criminalised as a consequence, and recognising the underlying symptoms of the challenges of social media in the modern age. So there is a real utility, I think, for using these well-deployed officers to avoid the criminalisation of young children who might otherwise then come to grief. So I hope that's helpful, but I do take the feedback, and I think it's something for us to make sure we embed into our strategy a review of our approach to how we look at the deployment of our officers across school settings, and as you say, PRUs as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So to the rest of the panel, I'll start this way this time. And I wanted to ask you, what, in your opinion, are the reasons that young people are excluded from school, and any feedback you can give or commentary on the rates of exclusion and how they have changed over the years. So perhaps we'll start again with Anthony and work down.
What we're finding currently is that we're finding that it's going to be quite controversial. I've got a friend of mine who leads one of the academies, but due to some of the pressures around the academies, we're finding that children, they're not using the term exclusion as much, but they're using the new term managed move. And these children are being moved from place to place, and some are actually going across postcodes to different places and getting excluded, ending up in PRUs. Now, to some children and young people, they find that going to a pupil referral unit is a badge of honour. Locally, we've tried to change terminologies, not call it a pupil referral unit, call it a special education setting, and trying to use different terminologies but getting to the same result. It's a pupil referral unit. Once children lose that uniformity, they can go to school in tracksuits and jeans and things like that, and meeting youth workers that look like them, reflect them. They also loses that sense of discipline and order. And sadly, we're finding that a lot of our young people feel like it's a badge of honour. So getting excluded means that I start at 10 o'clock, I get to eat whatever I want, I leave facility at 2, and as you know, with the public health approach, that is a direct link and pathway into criminality. If I was to push back to you, it would be the fact that the power of the engagement. I chair a meeting every Friday where I bring in the head teachers and the police and grassroots organisations, and I have to at this point throw in MOPAC, because with our organisation MyEnds, we're able to deploy mentoring organisations into school, and we've seen a complete reduction of exclusions in Croydon. Not only have we seen a reduction in exclusions in Croydon, but we've also seen a reduction in reoffending, because we have the head of youth justice sitting in our meetings, and we've had a reduction in reoffending. So I think our stats at the moment is like 97% non-reoffending. So children that have been criminalised, we don't get them reoffending due to the MyEnds network working in partnership with youth justice. So for us, it's about that intervention very quickly to stop the young people feeling that, yeah, let's just get excluded and let's find ourselves in the PRU, but our mentors are in the schools and encouraging them for better futures.
Yeah, no, I'll comment on the role that youth workers can play within a school setting. I don't have any statistics necessarily on exclusions per se, but I think that plays a valuable role in the holistic approach in terms of where you have teachers, pastoral care, where youth workers are able to work alongside, having that same parity of esteem in terms of the role that they play in a young person's life. Because depending on the locality in the area, you may well find that some of the young people there attend a local youth club. So having that relationship continue within a school setting has real positive benefits to attendance, just really to having a trusted adult that you have already confided in, that you can take throughout that school setting. So I think that that's a really important factor. It looks different in different schools and different areas, and from some of our engagement with some of our members and organisations, it really is dependent on the funder, it's dependent on the school, it's dependent on the head teacher's understanding of the role that a youth worker can play within that setting. But we would very much advocate and really speak to, I know NYA have published a report on youth work in schools, and it really talks to some of the added benefits that can be had in terms of young persons' attainment and just really their well-being within a school setting. So we really would advocate that there is a role that youth workers can play, but if it's not seen so much as an add-on, that it's really factored into that development in terms of the young person's well-being and their time through that school.
Absolutely. So school exclusions are a huge cause for concern for Liberty and our partners, particularly No More Exclusions, who are a Black-led grassroots group of young people and teachers who do really brilliant work on working to end school exclusion. So, you know, the data, we know there's a significantly high rate of exclusions, particularly for pupils from Black Caribbean communities, Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities. We know that school exclusion marks that kind of critical moment at which significantly affects the adversity affecting a young person, and also significantly impacts that young person's proximity to the criminal justice system. I also want to kind of link back to something that Anthony said around, you know, there's a sinister edge to exclusions. You know, there's so many ways in which children can be excluded from school in another name, whether it's managed moves, off-rolling, and so on. You know, there's a significant amount of case law as well that actually shows that, you know, pupil referral units are so stigmatised that, you know, we can't actually take that as an acceptable alternative for children and young people who are removed from their school. And actually we need to question why young people are being excluded in the first place. The most common cause in the data is persistent disruptive behaviour. We also have numerous government studies and reviews that show that, you know, so-called disruptive behaviour is actually a child, a young person actually saying, you know, I need support, I need something here. And just to kind of round off, the young people who wrote a chapter in Liberty's Holding Our Own Guide, members of No More Exclusions, they talked about, you know, the real pain of being excluded. It's a disappearing of an issue that could so easily be approached in a supportive and compassionate way, but actually exclusion is just wiping that issue and wiping that child essentially out of the mainstream education system, and the deep isolation that causes for a young person, you know, taking a young person away from their friends, their relationships with teachers, is utterly devastating. And so we kind of echo calls from not only No More Exclusions, but also the United Nations came out 2 weeks ago, concluding their working group of experts on people from African descent, saying, you know, exclusion is one of the many things that feeds the criminalisation of particularly black young people. So we echo calls for a moratorium on school exclusions.
I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Will, before I go to my next question.
Just very, very quickly, I mean, the Mayor's Violence Reduction Unit obviously are investing quite heavily in reducing exclusions, and Maureen McKenna, who was the Director of Education in Glasgow and oversaw a 90% reduction in exclusions in Glasgow, is working with my colleagues to develop a London Inclusion Charter. So rather than exclusion, we talk about inclusion. And the reason actually is for one of the points you made, Assembly Member, which is this is about all children missing education. So particularly children who are, for example, electively home educated, we know are some of the most vulnerable. As well. So inclusion kind of encapsulates all of those reasons why children might be missing education.
Thank you for that. And yeah, that piece of work with the VRU, MOPAC and others is, I think, really important. So starting this time with Jodie, so what non-policing interventions would help reduce exclusions in your, from Liberty's perspective?
Sure, thank you for that question. So I think we need to centre what young people are telling us about non-policing interventions. You know, young people that we worked with and are working with as part of the Holding Our Own campaign talk about the need, you know, for mental health support in schools. School is, you know, really difficult, and young people, you know, growing up in an environment like school as they are right now, that with significantly larger than average class sizes, lack of, you know, one-on-one support from specialist support staff, that's really impactful. So looking at what other services and what other support schools need to be able to encourage and support young people to thrive.
So can I just push you? So you have mentioned mental health support in schools, and, you know, so obviously we are straying into education rather than policing, which is the remit of this, which is the question I asked you. But what, in addition, kind of concretely, are the things that would work to reduce crime and criminality for children of school age, if there are not? Because you've talked about no more exclusions, which is absolutely. But what are the things that Liberty is recommending as interventions?
Absolutely. So as well as mental health support, which I do kind of reaffirm is really important, as looking at what the root causes are of crime and criminality, as you say. Also, we need to, I know that Pauline has spoken at length about this, but those trusted adults, if we're looking at class sizes that essentially bursting at the moment, how are young people actually able to build relationships with their teachers, with support staff? That's just not happening at the moment because resources are stretched so thinly. So how can we bring those relationships into school without the condition of criminal enforcement, which is that one of the crucial kind of issues with police in schools, is because it's, you know, if we talk about safer schools officers as being positioned in schools to build relationships with young people who might be at risk, then that's, you know, perhaps not the answer, when actually we need to peel back and look at trust and relationships before it gets to the point where other intervention may be needed. We need to avoid that happening in the first place, and we do that by enabling growth in trust and relationship building between young people and adults in school.
So before I move on to Pauline and Anthony to give your reflections on this question, when you say relationships between children and adults in schools, you're not meaning this. I'm just trying to understand what is the tangible thing. Do you mean not the safer schools officers?
Yeah, Liberty. Yeah, okay. Police shouldn't be in schools. Liberty's unequivocal in holding that position. Along with
teachers, teaching assistants.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, fine. If I could move on to Pauline and Anthony, and then I'm going to ask you, Commander Southworth, what would you want police officers to not be doing in this space? Because there is a question about what is the role of the officer, where it starts and where it stops. So while I ask Pauline and Anthony, if you could come back on that.
And if I could just put in a plea for brevity of responses, because we're very over time. Thank you.
Okay. I think I touched on already the role that youth workers can play within a school setting. So if we're talking about what non-policing interventions, I'd probably open that up wider in terms of the role that community grassroots organisations play, and the youth workers who are embedded in communities. It focuses on the informal education, because a lot of focus is on education, rightly so, but alongside that we have informal education that happens every day in community voluntary organisations supported by qualified and volunteer youth workers. And we've got a workforce here where it's made up of over 60% volunteers who are providing that one-to-one support, the targeted intervention, the group work on the ground every day in our data across London. Just with our members who we surveyed, over 520 organisations, they work with over 650,000 young people across a year, and they work with nearly 25,000 volunteers. And so those people are working every day, as well as the youth workers within those settings, providing different types of activities, be they sport programmes, social youth action programmes, art programmes, employability programmes, different ways of engaging young people in that informal setting to ensure that they can provide the support that a young person may need, that then carries over into school. Some children can't wait to get out of school. So I think we've got to really look at the role the informal and formal education plays, the role that youth workers play alongside trained teachers, because coming together, they're all holding the young children where they're at. And we just really need to take account of that in the programmes that our community and voluntary organisations are providing.
Okay, thank you. And then Anthony, finally.
My answer is going to be very brief, very quick. Invest in all grassroots and faith group organisations. Bottom line, invest in grassroots and faith group organisations. We have the community intelligence, the skill set to make things happen, and it needs to be done very quickly. It needs to be sustained. It needs to be over 5 to 10 years. Keep the investment going into grassroots. We are now seeing in London the benefits of investing in grassroots organisations to bring about a change, and it's full statutory to start listening to grassroots organisations that have their foot on the ground.
I'll go back to Commander Southworth and then Will, and I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much. I think things that to answer your question explicitly, things that we should be doing in terms of children and young people. Child missing persons is a particular challenge for us. We recognise that we probably still are over-reporting some instances of missing children. And by that I mean we're outside of policy in that children have been reported missing to us who aren't actually technically missing. It sounds an odd paradox, but it is true. We do a lot of joint work with, indeed, you've probably experienced it, Anthony, in your children and young people you deal with. And at the same time, we also need to continue the work we do with the care homes in particular, under Operation Philomena protocols, to reduce that phenomenon of children being over-reported as missing when they're not. This quite often has a disproportionate angle to it as well. So to your earlier points, in that we tend to find that children are getting adultified and then, reported to us as missing and gone rogue, etc., when in fact they're just outliving their lives. And in some instances, because of that, we can't see the wood for the trees and focus on the ones who genuinely are at potential risk of danger. So we'd rather focus our resources on those who need us and not pursuing those who are just not necessarily missing in that respect. There's a really substantial point of things that we wouldn't want to do around children being brought into police stations as a place of safety. This is something we've been tracking data on for a while now. It's something I really welcome the panel's help with and the committees, in that none of our officers want to be looking after very small children in police stations because we've had to bring them in as a place of safety. It happens far too frequently. It's not good for the children. Police stations are, as best we can, a comforting place, but to any child or young person being cared for by a police officer in a police setting like that, where we don't have the facilities or the bedding even to make them comfortable for a substantial period of time, highly inappropriate, not something that we want to do. Sometimes by sheer force of circumstance and lack of provision, we're forced down that road. But examples like this are things where we want our interactions with children and young people to be positive, and it's hard to make them so if we're pursuing young people who aren't actually missing, or indeed we're having to bring children into places of safety to police stations because there simply isn't the provision to put them into safer care facilities. So much can be done there, and that's just two sort of polar ends of the spectrum, but there's much in between as well, more than I can probably do in the time that we have, I'm afraid.
I mean, I'll be very brief. I think in terms of things like MyEnds, I think what we, in the old days, you talk about team around the child in terms of early help and team around the school. I think what MyEnds and programs like that does is see the school and the community and everything as a whole. And I think that's got to be the right way to look at these challenges.
Thank you. Very briefly, Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. And my question is to Commander Southworth. If I can, it's about safer schools. Officers, I represent Enfield and Haringey. Certainly, in discussions with my head teachers, they do value safer schools officers. So I'm interested in your new Child First approach. I hope that may alleviate some of the concerns that, for example, Liberty may have. But my concern is a practical one. Certainly the head teachers tell me, well, they value the relationship, and they often come up with an annual plan about what their safer school officer is going to do. They are too often pulled away or they're abstracted, and so they cannot be relied upon. And so often schools will arrange assemblies with external guests and then it'll be stopped at the last moment. So the suggestion that came from my head teachers was, in the safer schools field, could you perhaps offer a minimum guarantee of set number of hours or set events that they would not be abstracted from?
I can certainly try for you, Assemblymember McCartney. I'm afraid that's the best I can say. The demands on us at the moment are very high, as you know. In fact, today, as you'll probably be aware, sees the launch of the Right Care, Right Person initiative that my colleague alluded to before, where we're trying to minimise the times where we deploy to things that we, the police, shouldn't be deploying to, because the strain of that demand across our service is one of the many reasons why so often schools officers and others in valuable positions get pulled away, because we might need to resource central aid to a huge public order operation, of which, of course, as a capital city we have so many, whether it's a major event or just stop oil or whatever it is. So our officers are consistently required to come out of BCU settings to support central aid, and that's often exacerbated by the fact that we are then over deploying to incidents, some of which we've talked about today, whether it's mental health or missing persons. So anything we can do to reduce our overall demand strain will actually be the real answer, because then we can, far from being a discretionary thing that we do when we can, it becomes something we can almost aim to ring fence the role of the schools officer. That's a slight utopia from where I am today, because we know that we still very much strain on a daily basis to meet all of our 999 demand. So again, we have to think about risk in terms of what we do, but it's not that for a lack of commitment to the schools officer role, therefore, it's just that sometimes our demands do pull us away, but hence our focus on things like RCRP to try to drive that demand down, like Philomena to drive that demand down, so that we're still responding where we're needed, but we're not over-responding, and then we can do more of the work that we know we really want to do in places like schools.
Okay, that's helpful. However, it doesn't necessarily help my schools. So, you know, there are concerns that schools are saying it's just not worth it. And if we want a really partnership approach, that commitment needs to be there. But I do understand the stress you're under. But it is a concern I hear from my schools regularly.
Thank you for feeding them back.
I wonder if maybe the Safer Schools officer role could be replaced by youth workers, because that would deal with the abstraction issue and you would have that regularity of contact and that build up of those relationships with those trusted officers. But I'll leave that question hanging. Assemblymember Hall has very kindly dropped her questions because Safer Schools have been covered very extensively. Assemblymember Lord Bailey.
Thank you.
No, I'm so sorry. I've gone wrong. Assembly Member Prince. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm pleased about that, because Lord Bailey's always a tough act to follow. So this is just for Commander Southworth. Many of the guests we've had here over the time have recommended that the Met stop using knife imagery in social media. In fact, even the Mayor's own Violence Reduction Unit Young People's Action Group recommend that as well. So can you explain to me, please, why do the Met still continue to do, and will they revisit the policy, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Assemblymember Prince. This is an area that has developed a lot over the years. From the days when I mentioned before, I used to be head of Trident, and we used to routinely put out huge hoards of weaponry that we'd recovered, whether it was guns or knives, as a way of trying to reassure the public that we were actually seizing and reducing the amount of incidents of these things on the streets that would cause so much harm. But it's quickly been recognised since those days that actually it can be something that can drive fear and concern and even cause young people to self-harm in anticipation of a threat of violence. So very alive to that, we have significantly reduced the amount of times that we demonstrate image, or we use imagery of knives and indeed guns as well. The only thing we do still do is where it is part of a wider story, so it's not just a gratuitous or unnecessary display of a knife or a gun. Actually, it may still form part of a genuine media story around a specific crime, but we try to make sure that the weapon is not the focus of the story, if that makes sense. So it's not that it's been eradicated altogether, it does still happen, but there is a clear instruction to our colleagues not to simply display a knife in a tube because you've seized it off a young person as a way of demonstrating your good work that day, because we recognise that it can be deleterious to the mindset of young people and actually drive more of what we're trying to prevent. So we're trying to learn with that, we just haven't eradicated it completely.
So do you think you'll be able to review that policy? Who would we need to speak to get that policy reviewed?
My colleague, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Ward, who heads up our specialist crime wing, is actually leading the discussion within the MPS at the moment and with partners. So it's an ongoing discussion and collaboration, and please do, I'm sure we can write to one another afterwards.
Perhaps, Chair, the committee could write to Assistant Commissioner Ward.
Thank you very much. That was admirably brief. Assemblymember Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just quickly say about exclusions? I think people need to bear in mind that schools very reluctantly exclude young people. I've been a governor of a number of schools, and there's a lot of work done before a young person is excluded, and I wouldn't want anybody watching this to just think schools do it willy-nilly. They think through that process very carefully, not only because of their legal requirements, if nothing else. I'm going to start with Anthony, and then I'll come to Jodie and then to Pauline. What are your thoughts on the way the Met interacts with young people through stop and search, and what impact do you think this is having on trust and confidence of young Londoners, and the Met's work to protect people from violence?
Thank you, Lord Bailey. One thing I'm very passionate about is having discussions with the Met and having the Met understand some of the trans and intergenerational traumas that, for example, when I sit down with a cohort of young people, 50 to 100 young people on a weekly basis, I ask them, how many of you have been taken into the back of a police van and have a narrative that you've been beaten in a police van, etc. Not one young person has that narrative. However, they have perceptions on the Met Police because of intergenerational and transgenerational challenges, because uncle was arrested in Stoke Newington, granddad was arrested in after the Cherry Gross incident at the Brixton riot. So, you know, they have narratives, but not necessarily their lived experience. When it comes to stop and search now, a lot of young people have said there's been adultification, they've been treated like they're big people. And what we had to do, Lord Bailey, is get our young people to get into spaces with the Met Police and at commissioner level and commander level. We took them in Scotland Yard to share their experiences of stop and search, for officers to hear firsthand what their experiences are when young people have been stop and search, and on many occasions wrongfully. And it was for commander level to realise, hold on here, we've got an issue here. And one commander turned around and said, I accept that my child hasn't had the same experience as young Darren or young Johnny from Croydon or Brixton. One commander said, I can accept that my child wouldn't ever face that level of challenge. One commander actually accepted that. And for me, that's where the conversation started. That's where I started to see a change and a turnaround, because it showed that, and I'm talking about the new level of leadership, they were in a position where they were starting to listen and accept that, look, the way that young people are communicating their experiences, this is a cause for concern. So it needs to be done fairly and proportionately. So what we did is the same young people that were impacted through the stop and searches, we now train and we pay them through MyEnds to train the police officers on how to stop and search appropriately. The results were stop and search reduced in Croydon. And young people now found that they can have conversation and dialogue with the Met Police. It became more about conversation versus enforcement. And with the training that we had with the officers, it saw a reduction in stop and search. So the impact of it was that our young people now, those who are more vocal about it, are now training the Met. And now we're seeing trust and confidence built. But previously, a young person's narrative wasn't necessarily based on their own experience. Some of it was because of what they heard.
It's the uncle story. I had a young person recently tell me about a Black Mariah. And I just thought you're definitely not old enough to know about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Jodie.
Thank you. I think I'll echo a lot of what Anthony said. We know that stop and search is deeply harmful for young people. You know, there's stacks and stacks of evidence that says that. You know, looking at the IOPC National Learning Report last year, you know, that outlined case after case after case of the deep trauma caused by stop and search. Yeah, countless cases. I won't go into any for the sake of time. We've got groups like Hackney Account, community monitoring groups made up of young people who are talking to their peers about stop and search and publishing, you know, reports about it, about the, you know, the mistrust, lack of confidence they have in
Sorry,
the
Joy,
police,
to interrupt you.
when
Are they saying no more stop and search, a different type of stop and search? What are those young people saying?
I think across the board, many young people want to see stop and search reduced. And I think a specific, we can highlight Section 60 in particular. If we look at the way that Section 60 is used, you know, it's a sledgehammer approach to reducing violence, and it just doesn't work. You know, it's a deeply ineffective practice. The data that came out from the Home Office about a month ago said that only 3% of all searches in the year ending March 2023 resulted in an offensive weapon or firearm being found. We've had the College of Policing publish reports over and over again saying that stop and search has no statistically significant crime reduction effects.
Jodie, can I just challenge that notion? one take on that stat about 3% could be the notion that you are going to get stop and search. I've done 30 years of youth work, and when in my local area, I come from West London, Ladbroke Grove, knife possession went through the roof when everybody told the police to stop because people thought they weren't going to get found. So this idea that only 3% signifies a failure, do you hold to that? Are you sure that's a failure?
I think it's a failure because then we're looking at groups and groups of young people, particularly young black men, who have to deal and hold the humiliation and pain of a stop and search where nothing is found. That's not something that we can hold. That's not something that I think, and you know, the young people that we worked with for the production of our current ongoing campaign, that's not something that they want to tolerate either. You know, if we look back to a point I made earlier, perceptions of safety amongst young people that we worked with are that they are being, you know, it's not something that they feel like they deserve. You know, what police are telling them when they're stopping them in the street and not finding anything and instead inflicting trauma upon them is that safety is something that is for other people and not them. So, you know, that's not something that I think we should tolerate across our city.
I'll come to you, Auntie. Let me quickly go to Pauline. Let me tweak it slightly, Pauline. Much of the conversation we've had this morning has been about trust and confidence. The only bit that's disappointed me is the very infrequent mention of parents. Anthony made the point that young people are conveying experiences that their community has had. Do you think the Met does enough to engage communities, in particular parents? Because we've talked about early intervention. The best form of early intervention is not professionals, it's parents. That's a fact. Parents carry a community. And I just wonder if you feel that enough is being done in that space.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all. And, you know, if I've honed in more on the youth sector and the role that youth practitioners play, that represents, you know, the organisation that I work with. But it doesn't discount the role that parents play in the life of a child. But what we also have to acknowledge, I mean, when you speak about family units that are working well, where parents are there, providing the breakfast, providing the food, it's okay, that works. So very often you home in on where it isn't working so well. So it's easy to say, yes, parents have a role to play, but we, you know, as London Youth and the members that we represent and the work that they do, very often it's in spaces and areas where young people aren't getting that full wraparound support from, you know, a tight family unit that will pat them down and make sure that they're fed. You'll find, because of some of the inequalities and the areas of deprivation that a lot of these organisations are working within, they're working with children who aren't getting that full family support. So it's not to say that the role of parents and family isn't important. It is important. But it's just acknowledging we're dealing with a lot of young people across the capital who aren't getting that parental support. So what do we do then? You know, youth workers, and I will always advocate for the role that youth workers play, very often they step into that gap. They fill that gap. They hold that young person. They provide the guidance, the support. They explain to them, you know, and you see in terms of lots of different institutions, even touching on stop and search, how to respond in different situations, because nobody wants it to escalate. So how do you work with a young person to ensure that things don't escalate for them, that you're constantly there for them? And I think that is the role that a lot of our grassroots community organisations and the youth workers within those organisations are playing. They're filling in a gap where there is a gap in some households and in some communities.
Thank you. Anthony.
So I just want to get... My apologies. And I really hear where Jodie's coming from. I just want to go back to something on stop and search. Working with families that have lost their siblings, and I can name numerous families that have lost their siblings to stop and search, the impact that it's had on the families. I've sat down with 4 families that have lost a sibling or a child to knife crime. They are the biggest advocates of stop and search, coupled with the siblings of those that have, I can name the Goupil family in Croydon, I can name Eliane's family, I will name them by name because I work with them, the Cools family in Croydon, the Godwin family up in Tottenham, Yvonne Lawson, and I can name them, that would advocate for stop and search. Their wider circle of friends and peers would advocate for stop and search because they're the ones that had to sit and go through the trauma of burying a loved one, and they felt that if stop and search was in place earlier, maybe their son or daughter would remain alive today. So it's not that I'm disputing where you're coming from, but I have to also amplify the voices of those that have been impacted deeply through loss of life, that stop and search is advocated. And I want to link it to your point as well. families need to know the importance of stop and searching your children before they leave their house too. So I wanted to leave it on that point.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring my last question to the Met. In view of the reactions we've just had to stop and search, what more could the Met do to make sure that the interaction is positive? I'm a black man. I was born and raised in this city. I've been stopped 1,000 times. I'd argue 3 or 4 of them have been horrible. The rest of them have been, I've got over it. But the notion that all stop and search is traumatic is problematic, because what's most problematic is getting stabbed to death. That's really problematic. So what can the Met do to make sure that those stops and searches are at least accepted by the communities they are meant to be protecting?
Thank you, Lord Bailey, and to all the comments today. I think the challenge for us, of course, is to balance all these different views, isn't it? So we get that point of consent exactly right, recognising Jodie's view and recognising the views of, as you say, the families of people who've lost their loved ones to knife crime. In terms of our new stop and search charter, you may be aware of, Lord Bailey, it's been formulated by the Met under the new Met for London strategy. My colleague DAC Adelakan is actually leading on that for us, and it's going to be co-produced with the community to try and make sure that not only do we do only a surgically necessary amount of stop and search, and for reassurance of colleagues here, stop and search is actually down by 19% and use of section 60 is down by 41%. So we are doing far less, but in keeping with the Commissioner's stated aim to be more precise in what we do, where we use intelligence-led activity to guide stop and search rather than subjective factors. That's how we can make sure that we try to make the most use of an effective tactic to prevent violent crime, and that when we do, through the stop and search charter being co-produced with our communities, recognising the voice of children and young people in particular, we try to make sure those interactions are absolutely positive, recognising the key encounter that they are, and the officers fully explain what it is that they're trying to do, as they should under the Go Wise policy anyway, grounds, objectives, so on and so forth, so that children and young people in particular, but all members of our community, understand that we're doing it for their safety and indeed for the safety of others as well, and it's not that they're being targeted in some way. So in summary, a more precise use in line with our new stop and search charter as it's formed in collaboration with our community, and ultimately trying to walk that line between the need for, as you say, a very well recognised enforcement tool, but in a way that balances with the acknowledgement that if we don't get it right, we will lose the hearts and minds of the communities we're trying to save, and lose the potential community intelligence that goes with that could help us not need the tactic in the first place. So it really is circular, isn't it? If we don't get it right, then we lose the very hearts and minds of the community we're trying to save.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Mermer, very briefly.
Very briefly, I just wanted to echo and agree with the points that Lord Bailey and Anthony, I think you spoke to the same point about, yes, agree that there are issues with stop and search, and nobody more than this side of this curve wants to see those changed. But from a constituency perspective, I very much echo the fact that it is nuanced, and I don't necessarily think it's right to say that it should all be banned. We absolutely disagree with the racial profiling aspects of it. But those stories that you talk about, somebody's child is dead and they wish that the police had been, or there is peace for 2 days because there is a Section 60 in place, rightly or wrongly, I think we can't just discount that side of the argument in making sure that we reform stop and search and reduce it to a situation where everybody is equally affected by it, and the police use it in an intelligence-led way, not just as a tool for kind of harassment of people.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a statement, not a question.
It was a statement. My question was answered, but I just wanted that on record.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. So we've reached almost the very end of this meeting. It has been an incredible conversation, and I want to thank all of you for your input. I just have one final question, which is for the Met and for MOPAC. Now, we heard on our committee visit to Bethnal Green Police Station, the Met officers described stop and search as like taking a bulldozer to an archaeological dig, and they described the need to reduce the use of the tactic because of its imprecision, and that it needs to be, if it is going to be used as a tactic to keep people safe, that it needs to be used more precisely, and to tackle the issues of disproportionality and all the other issues that have been raised. So Given that the Stop and Search dashboard clearly shows that the age range of people most frequently stopped by the police is young people aged 18 to 24, followed by young people aged 14 to 17, what more do you think you can do to address the concerns that people do have about Stop and Search to ensure that that age group in particular of young people are kept safe? So to Kevin first, and then we'll...
Thank you, Chair, for that question. And I think the hardest thing to tackle, of course, in this is that awful correlation that we see with those very same age brackets. Of course, the exceptionally high instances, far too high, that we see of knife injury violence and particularly knife homicides in the city. So if we take as our premise the fact that a lot of Stop and Search is effective precisely to recover knives from the streets and stop young people from coming to harm, the inevitable corollary of that is we will end up using that tactic more against young people than we do perhaps against the older community. It isn't that we're wrongfully targeting young people in that respect, it's just that it's a natural consequence. If you're trying to stop knife crime amongst young people, you will inevitably stopping and searching more young people. I think I can only hark back to my previous point that we are reducing our numbers significantly, nearly 20% reduction this year and a 40% reduction in Section 60s, to try to embrace exactly that precision-led approach that we talked about, which Assembly Member echoed a moment ago, about being more precise in how we use our intelligence-led policing tactics to identify those situations and those individuals who may be more likely to be carrying a knife, because it's never going to be an exact science, and as long as we continue to use the tactic, there will always be some who feel they've been wrongfully affected, and that's where the quality of the interaction comes in, I think, testament to Lord Bailey's point. So within all this, our Stop Search Charter will weave all of this together into what we hope is a far more refined and surgical approach to the use of this tactic. Probably will, if I'm honest, continue to affect young people more than it does the older, but that is, of course, an inevitable side effect of the fact that so much knife and homicide-related knife crime falls in more young communities.
And when do you expect the Stop and Search Charter to be public?
I'm afraid I can't answer that because I'm not leading on that particular strand of work, but my colleague DAC Adelekin is, so I can speak to them and write to you.
If you could ask and write back, that would be absolutely fantastic. Will, did you just want to add anything?
Yeah, just briefly. I think Kevin's absolutely right, and I think it's the charter and the clear community engagement within that just gives a better mandate. It's the use of the precision Stop and Search, which is coming centrally and into the 6 wards. But I would encourage panel members to look at the youth survey that MOPAC's just published, because it explores some of the issues that we've talked about today and gives us a bit of evidence. So, for example, going to the point that Assemblymember Moema and Lord Bailey made about what the impact of Stop and Search is. If it's done well, we see that there isn't actually much of a correlated drop in terms of trust and confidence. But if it's done badly, there is. And to play out the sort of nuanced debate on Stop and Search, about 50% of young people told us that 50% of people told us that they do think Stop and Search helps people stop carrying knives. 50% do not. So I just think this is a really nuanced debate, and it's really important that we listen to young people and communities themselves about the issue. Clearly these experiences that they're having are the things that can have the greatest causality for us doing something about this.
And because there was also the response of the young people in your survey in terms of the reaction of the police during a Stop and Search. Less than half of them stopped, said the police were polite or treated them with respect.
Absolutely.
And so is that the kind of thing, evidence that is being fed into the Stop and Search Charter?
Indeed, and into the Child First strategy, Chair, as well. I think it's that recognition that the quality of that interaction, the need to see the child as exactly that first and foremost, is central to everything. And lifting our cultural competence in that space will be a journey. It'll take time, I think, to get to that point where a very busy frontline workforce all too often could potentially fall into that trap of failing to see that person as a child first.
Thank you. I have a final, very brief comment from Marina.
Thank you, Chair. Just to assist and possibly to assist Commander Southworth as well, there have been 2 pilot run-ins of precision stop and search, and one of them was in Lambeth in my constituency. I can assure you I have asked specifically to be on the training for that, and the issues that you've raised, Chair, I know were actually addressed there, so we're waiting for the results of that to come out now, and literally it's just finished, so hopefully we will be able to see something positive in what's going to happen around that. Thank you.
Thank you. So, sorry, I need to get to the bit that I need to say at the end of the meeting. Can I thank all our guests for joining us this morning and for your answers to the committee's questions. We're now going to adjourn briefly before greeting and welcoming our next panel of youth practitioners who we're going to hear from next. So thank you so much for all your comments and answers to our questions. And do I then just adjourn? Welcome back. Can I now introduce our second panel of guests today? So we have Louise McNestry, who is a Rise Up Programme Manager for London Youth. And then we've got a group of Rise Up Programme practitioners. We have Joseph Lynch from Babel Theatre, Josephine White from Little Acorn Services, Zey Binboga from Displaced, Jade Newton-Gardner from Fully Focused Productions and IMAP, and Tanya Obiak from Unitas Youth Zone. So welcome to all of you. And I'd like to just start by asking you each, and starting with Louise, to briefly explain the work that your organisation is doing to protect young people from violence. So, Louise.
Thank you. So working for the organisation London Youth, obviously a membership organisation for youth organisations in London. So the Rise Up programme has been funded by the VRU, and it's just wrapping up its third year in its current state. And it's a youth practitioner development programme, kind of looking at leadership, but also kind of giving some real fundamental training to support the young people that they work. So kind of building and developing the practitioners. As we know, education for youth workers isn't as large as it used to be. So being able to provide this opportunity through weekly programs of training for youth practitioners to access.
That sounds absolutely great. So Joseph, do you want to say what, Babel Theatre does, what kind of work you do?
Absolutely. So Babel Theatre are a theatre company. We make touring productions that go around the UK. That is not just live theatre, but also films. And then we run a number of workshops and creative programmes all around the UK and increasingly the world that work with people, young people across a spectrum of different experiences and backgrounds. What that looks like is bespoke workshops, but also longer creative programs working with suicide and youth violence prevention, particularly with young men and fathers, is an increasing area of our work. At the moment, we've just become a charity, so that's very exciting. And lots of board meetings. We are increasingly being asked to be a partner with youth hubs or organisations that are working on the front line of youth violence because of our practice of developing young people from quite a holistic approach, and particularly around developing their awareness of what is going on with themselves and their ability to express that, which I believe is a really core problem in youth violence.
Thank you. Josephine, do you want to tell us about Little Acorn Services?
Yes, I work for Little Acorn Services. It's a semi-independent provider, and we look after young people from 16 to 18. Our young people are unaccompanied asylum seekers and young people who come into care from the UK, so from families that are settled here. We look at, they come in because of some form of trauma, and we look at how that has evolved. We try to help them with key work sessions to understand safety, independent skills. And as a result of me going to Rise Up, they have helped me in understanding more deeply trauma-informed practice, looking at the wider spectrum of violence with these young people. As a result, we opened up a CIC company also to help young people, because we realized that a lot of them, when they leave care, they go on to get really deeper involved in crime. There's issues such as poverty that causes that, issues homelessness, and so we've got this company that we've opened up, and with all the training that I've received from Rise Up, it helps us to build a bridge for those young people, for somewhere for them to come and where we can support them.
Thank you. And Zey, do you want to tell us about Displaced?
Sure. So I'm the CEO and founder of Displaced. We're a community interest company, mostly working around North London, so Haringey, Enfield, a little bit in Hackney as well. Our focus is essentially looking at the impact of racialised identity and migrant experience on young people's mental health. So what we do is we deliver workshops that is essentially around developing young people into being community advocates and creating emotionally safe spaces where young people can explore their ethnic identity, and we take an intergenerational approach. So we look at working with parents and grandparents with a young person and building bridges and understanding and empathy to hopefully reduce young people's kind of lack of sense of belonging.
Thank you. And Jade, this is so helpful just to understand where, what all of you are basically working on before we move into the next questions. Jade, Fully Focused Productions and IMAP.
Yeah, so I'm Jade. I work part-time for an organisation which is called Fully Focused Productions, which is a youth-led media production organisation. We also run MyEnds, which is the fastest growing short-form platform on YouTube. And that's also youth-led. My role there is the Youth Wellbeing and Engagement Coordinator, so I look after all the young team, and essentially we have members who all have film as an interest, but it's also a space in which they can share their experiences and feel safe to explore their interests, but with a view of moving into the film industry, and we give them access and the ability to play out in the different varying roles that they're interested in, and then they home in on what role that it is that they want to do, and we will try and access them or signpost them to places where they can actually get real life experience. I think the beauty of Fully Focused is that we don't have a cut-off kind of deadline. It's not like a 6-week program. This is like lifelong. So we've had young people, it started 12 years ago, who started when it first happened, which actually was kicked off by the riots, and they created a short documentary called Right from Wrong. And that young person, who was one of the catalysts to creating Fully Focused, is still a member today and still accesses our support. And then I also run my own not-for-profit organisation called IMAP, which stands for I Am a Person, which is, its aim is to reignite play and playfulness in community to support health, well-being and discovery of potential. So throughout my 22 years of working in the play and youth work profession, I have always connected play work and play theory in my approach to working with all age groups, whether they're young people or adults. And I think that is a very key thing that needs to happen, which I will probably speak about a bit later on. But through IMAP, what I want to do and what I do is I do 3 main things. Mentoring, but playful mentoring, so reconnecting young people and adults to their playfulness, because play is actually where we find our gifts and our purpose and our passions. I do playful parties, which is about, instead of having this big entertainer that most kids are scared of, like Peppa Pig, I actually create a play space. Peppa Pig, in terms of sometimes it's a bit fearful for them to see this big, huge thing. I know my kids don't like it when they have them dressed up, but I create... real life. So I create a play space based on my client's themes or the child's interests, and I create a play environment which has open-ended play as well as activities. And then I do bespoke workshops that uses playful engagement and playful methods and activities that then get unpacked. But one of the key things I do is I share play theory with the general public, which is definitely something that's needed for parents, professionals that work with children and young people, because it's key to understand that young people still play and they need to play. And I feel that that's part of the issue why we have the problems we do today.
Thank you. And Tanya, finally, can you tell us about Unitas Youth Zone?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Tanya, and I'm relatively new to youth work. I've been doing youth work for 2 years now at Unitas Youth Zone. So we are located in Colindale, in Barnet, in one of the most deprived part of the borough. And my young people are mainly of black and working class young people, so it's a very much working class area. We've got also a lot of refugees from Afghanistan as well, and a lot of kids from Eastern Europe. So I work with a wide variety of young people from different backgrounds and ethnicities. I do a lot of work in sports, so I'm a basketball player, so I work with sort of organizing activities in the sports hall, and also building relationship with my young people, and I've been doing that for 2 years. And everything that I'm doing as a youth worker, I've earned it. So it wasn't easy at the beginning, especially a young woman sort of playing basketball in a space that can be quite competitive. So I've managed to break through all those barriers to build a relationship with my young people, and they are opening up to me more, and I've built that trusted relationship now, and I feel more confident to doing youth work in a very trusted way. And at Unitas, what we do, so we've got the sports hall, but we've also got different activities going on, health and well-being, we've got music, we've got arts, we've got a rec area. So it's a very much leisure place. So young people after school, they'll come and they'll just have fun, talk to youth workers, have their mentorship going. They also build their CVs and also try to get work experiences as well. So to summarize Unitas, we're very much a leisure center where young people can just come and just breathe and just relax and learn new skills. And I am in the sports hall. That's me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's given us a really good overview, background to where you're all coming from. Now, the sort of first question has to be about the phrase serious youth violence. It's something that we've been discussing all the way through this, and we heard earlier from the police that it is a statistical term that is used for as a measure in some of the Metropolitan Police data sets, but we also have heard very strongly from some young people who we heard from at the last meeting, and also from some of our guests in the first panel, that attaching serious youth violence together, it can be stigmatizing for young people. And so we've heard a kind of the idea that it could be better to talk about young people affected by violence so that it's not intrinsic in the young people, the violence. And I just wondered if any of you have any thoughts about what the term serious youth violence means to you. Who else?
I'm happy to jump in on that.
Joseph.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to the question. The first part is about serious, and the second part is about youth violence. And let's talk about youth violence first, which I think is the bigger part of it, which puts the determination on young people as the perpetrator of violence. And I think it was Lord Bailey that was talking earlier about victim and perpetrator to Anthony King. And I think it's important to consider that in our practice, we talk about violence as the demonstration of a need. And so when a young person is being violent, they are trying to demonstrate an unmet need that they have. And so we have to ask the question, like, what is the situation that they are in, that their needs are not being met, and the way that they have determined that they can meet it is through violence. And I think that is a societal question that goes on to talk about class and race in much of the way that the panel was talking about it previously. The second part of the question about serious also suggests that there is serious violence and silly violence, insignificant violence, when actually if you kind of put it in a different context and talk about self-harm, which is violence. The difference between someone cutting their wrists and taking their life is only a few degrees, and it's a contextual difference. And in mental health, you wouldn't make that determination. If someone is self-harming, that is a very serious thing, and it's not to be played down as an insignificant level of violence. So I think there's just a contextual understanding needed about that as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Does anyone else want to comment on this? Otherwise we can move on to the next question. No? Okay. So in which case we will move on to Joanne.
Thank you. We heard in the earlier panel about the complex causes of violence. Can be poverty, lack of opportunity, family circumstances, etc. Do you think there's the right balance in London between work to tackle those underlying causes and police enforcement? I don't know who wants to jump in. Oh, at the end, I'm sorry, I can't read your name because I haven't got my glasses. I haven't got my glasses. But the two at the end have got their lights on, so.
Oh, how'd you put your light on? Sorry.
Yeah, that's perfect.
I think that one of the things I wanted to say in terms of the background of youth violence, and for me, which is really key, is the decline in play and play opportunities for children and young people. The UN Convention of Children's Rights states that children and young people have the right to play, have fun, have recreational spaces and leisure time that is chosen. That's kind of non-existent in terms of play terms right now, and it's declined, and it has an impact on anxiety, depression, and their ability to control their emotions, their locus of control. I feel like we have to address that in order for us to also address the violence, because through playing, and especially risky play, that's the way in which young people or children are able to regulate their emotion, to constructively deal with fear and disputes, and just deal with social disagreements. But because there's been such a major decline, all of that learning and development is not happening. And then we've obviously had the pandemic, which doesn't help. So with, like they said in the last panel, they started to speak about early years and Sure Start. That was when I started my kind of dive into play work, and it was amazing. And I've seen it decline over the last 12, 13 years. And plays declined, and then off the back of that, youth work has declined. So I feel that what needs to happen is there needs to be more focus and training for youth workers to become playful youth workers that connect play work and play theory together in order to create a more richer, holistic approach to working with children and young people in order to support in their development and growth. I feel like there's not enough of a balance between the work that we do and enforcing the law and supporting the community. I feel like there should be a lot more understanding of play within institutions, including the police. They need to have some understanding of play, because it will change their perspective and understanding of what they see when they see young people in a group on the corner. Everything to do with play and young people is deemed as a nuisance or antisocial. You go to a park. Recently I went to the park with my kids, and there's a group of young people in the park. For me, they're playing, but you could see the adults are looking at them like, why are they here? What's going to happen? Like, there's fear already building up, and they have no space. So in order for them to not be looked at as or deemed as doing something antisocial or a nuisance, play theory needs to be widely available and looked at so that we can change the perspective of how we see young people. And that, for me, is where the unbalance comes from.
Thank you. And I think actually surveys of children show that as well.
Absolutely.
That's what they want, and if you like, we talk about children growing up too quickly, that's sort of the reverse.
Absolutely.
Or the same, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, play is serious. You talked about serious youth violence. Play is actually serious, but we look at it as like it's just child's play. It's not that important, and it's only focused on children up to a certain age. As soon as you hit the schooling system, play disappears, and everything's focused on the adult agenda and where children are supposed to be. But actually, children grow at their own pace in their own time.
Yeah.
And play is diluted.
That's the point, very well made, actually. Yeah. Does anybody else have any views on whether we have the balance right in London? I'll start with Zey, then go to the end. Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about when you ask that question. So first of all, I work mostly with Kurdish and Turkish speaking and Cypriot communities. In terms of understanding of community, a major issue, a major aspect of experience that is not being considered or properly understood, especially by social services as well as our current police, is the generational trauma that comes from the migration system that we have, as well as essentially how that can impact a young person's place in society. So let me kind of open that up a little bit more. So, for example, there will be situations where using, let's say, the Cypriot example, there was a war in Cyprus that resulted in many people, this is very top level, by the way, in terms of summary, but let's say there's a war in Cyprus, right, and then you have people that have come to the UK that have fled war, a big proportion of which was mostly within like the kind of mid-70s. And that then results, these individuals then end up, they come to the UK, they go through traumatic experiences, having first-hand view of war within their home country, and then let's say they flee to England, they finally kind of find this semblance of safety, and then they go through a migration system which essentially has to qualify them, qualify their experience of the trauma that they've experienced, like qualify like what is their reasons for coming to the UK, what is the contributions that they're going to make to British society, and then they come to the UK and essentially they have an experience where they need to relearn what their whole life was previous to that moment. They need to learn how UK systems work. They need to learn essentially what is their new life going to be in this completely different country. And then you've also got, as well as needing to learn all of that and acclimatise into British society, you then have the added unaddressed trauma of literally experiencing a war. A war, like there's so many complex traumas that come from that in itself. And then essentially what ends up happening is a lot of this trauma is unaddressed. A lot of this trauma, families don't get the support that they need from a mental health perspective, as well as from a community support perspective, because they need to build their community. Like things are very much at a lot of things are starting from scratch, essentially. And so what happens then is you end up having adults who are trying to then raise their children in a system that they're still learning. Their children are trying to teach their parents even how these systems work, because they're being schooled within this system. And so essentially, to summarize all of that, there's generational trauma that can be built up from this variety of experiences. This generational trauma is not being supported or addressed within the services and systems that we have at play. We have, for example, translators who we have like the option of, for example, having a translator, but then that translator, that first of all, translators are not necessarily widely available. They don't necessarily have that relationship with the individual that they're translating for, and so they end up, these individuals in these kind of migrant kind of communities then need to go to community organisations who are not receiving the support that they should be receiving from the government, from the police, from the variety of different funding sources. And essentially what ends up happening is parents then end up trying to raise their children as best as they can with a very minimal amount of support. And essentially what I'm trying to say here is there is a clear connection between migrant experience and young people's mental health.
Yeah.
And then when you're having an enforcement system, when you've got policing, which essentially a lot of the time triggers young people, uses tactics which are frankly not necessarily person-centered, let's say, that creates a situation where there can't be a conducive result. It creates more space for conflict. It creates more space where young people are being kind of pushed out into the edges of society, which then also results in young people being a lot more open to them being criminally exploited as well, because they don't have that understanding, or they don't feel like they're being understood within their families, and so they get pushed out onto the streets, and essentially streets end up raising them instead of their own families. So that's a little bit of the issue.
That's helpful, and I represent Enfield and Haringey, so I understand what you're saying. And of course, some of those communities, their original country, the police were not trusted at all as well. So there's other issues playing out. But I think it's interesting that we have here people who have got very different but very, I suppose, detailed knowledge of the communities they work with. Perhaps I can move on to Tanya, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just very briefly. I think what Zey said is absolutely spot on. Some of my young people are refugees, and the way that we speak about refugees in this country and also the hostile environment does have an impact. Absolutely. Notably when it comes to belonging, when it comes to identity, when it comes to pride and culture, this is important. But just touching on the aspect of law enforcement and sort of poverty and all these sort of systemic inequalities and all of this, they do have an impact. But I guess coming back to the nature of youth work and what we do, we are in the community building those trusted relationships. And it takes time to do that. And as youth workers, we get what we earn with young people. So, listening to the panel earlier, have we heard about youth workers and their voices? Are they being consulted in all those strategies? Because I would have liked to be consulted. I would like my colleagues to be consulted, because we have those trusted relationships with young people and we understand what they are going through. We understand that they've got challenges at school. They open up to us after building those relationships with them. And that's why we are important as young people, as youth workers, my apologies, is because we've got that contact, that grassroots contact with young people. So I just wanted to emphasise this.
I think that's really a really good point, and I think that's probably on a London-wide level. I'm sure London Youth itself would put out communications urging people to respond, but also locally, whether your local police or partners are actually actively asking for your opinions is important. But if I can move to my next question, and that's about the Rise Up programme, obviously funded by the Mayor and the Violence Reduction Unit. Has it been useful, I suppose, is my question, and what's it done for you? And I think I'm probably going to be asked you to be quite concise. But who wants to? I'm going to go, and I'm going to come to Louise at the end. So, Josephine, you haven't. Yeah, do you want to tell me? Because you started saying a little bit earlier about it.
Yeah. Yes. The Rise Up program has opened up I'm going to speak for myself, my understanding, more deeply, to look more in depth at young people for example, for adverse childhood experience, look a lot deeper into it, how to look at my practice to make it more trauma-informed, to look more deeply in how young people are presenting. When I got into Little Acorn Services, semi-independent provider, we provided a service. We are just now being regulated by Ofsted. So it was an unlicensed business, and we provide a service looking after the young people, key working them, but never really looking more widely, more deeper into the issues that they have, like the trauma, looking more deeper. Going to Rise Up allowed me to look more widely, look at, not contextual safeguarding, not just safeguarding on the surface, keeping them safe, giving them practices like safety plans and stuff like that, but more looking at where did they come from? Look at the trauma that really affected them. Was it music? Parentage, so that Rise Up program allowed me to look a lot deeper. Now, I've taken a lot of that learning back to my practice now and have let them know that, working with empathy is not just on the surface, it's something which is more deeper, more widely. I like the quote from Samuel L. Jackson, everything is not always as it seems. On the surface, they look okay, they talk to you, but you're not really looking and going a lot deeper into their trauma.
Can I ask then on that, do you get better results now with your young people than you used to before you had the training?
I'm getting a lot better, more results with, yes, my relationship and building that with the young people is a lot better. I've taken this training, so I'm training my staff now to look deeper into young people. When you are providing this service, we're looking wider at, where they're coming from, more listening to them, but listening inside and outside and really understanding what they're saying about violence and trauma and where it's actually coming from and what they're really experiencing, that is not just something that is on the surface in terms of them just feeling like that. There's a deeper empathy, there's a deeper knowledge, a deeper place that they're coming from. One of the young people I was talking to, he came on a boat, got to Calais, got to France, and needed to come across. And he said, you don't understand what we have to do to get here. So in terms of that, once they get here, there are things that they can be drawn back into because they have an expectation when they come to the UK to say that we are going to be safe and you are going to help us. We have holdbacks from local authority. Yes, they are providing a service, they are trying to help them, but there are other areas and issues that they're not really getting. And that in terms allows them, I would say, sometimes to want to, or make them more vulnerable then, to be groomed, to get to somewhere that they can help their family back home, to have a life here, to find their community. So they actually kind of are very vulnerable and get drawn into life of crime. Sometimes not because they want to, but because they see it as a reality of their survival, and they're going to get into it just to survive. A lot of them have regrets. A lot of them don't listen because it's not that they're not listening, but they're seeing that as the way out. So what Jade was saying in terms of having these spaces where we can introduce play and education for young people, we need more of that because we do know that it has declined over the time. but we are working with what we actually have.
Thank
and
you.
so I do believe, just before you go, that it is a good idea for youth practitioners to work with the police, to get them to understand. They need to come into our services, listen to the young people, because then they'll get a better understanding of where they're coming from and what they're trying to let them know that if you speak to me in a certain way, I'm going to react in a certain way.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Joseph, can I ask you, how has Being on the Rise Up programme helped you, and more importantly perhaps then translated into helping your young people?
Yes, absolutely. It's been really transformative for us, and me specifically. It's a very rare opportunity to have this kind of level and scale of professional development, and I have very strong opinions about the resources that are available to youth workers. I believe that youth workers pay a passion tax. They are heavily invested in the lives of young people because a lot of youth workers come from similar backgrounds to the people they end up working with. But because of that, they are critically invested in keeping young people alive, keeping people safe, but face low pay, face very little chance for professional development other than maybe becoming a manager of a youth centre, and then face also no skills development either. For us as a theatre company, we've been doing youth work for as long as we can remember and not known that we were doing it, which I think is quite dangerous in some senses, you know. And I think what Rise Up represents for us is a massive upskilling in things like conflict resolution, in understanding the lives of the young people that we're working with, in knowing where our boundaries are as practitioners, and being connected to a wider community of an ecosystem that we can help young people navigate also. I think the thing that has been most effective for us and what we are now able to do with young people is go to a much deeper level of work with them to unpick what's going on inside and help them get that out, which, you know, a lot of youth services and practitioners don't have the time or the resources to do that work. It's keep them busy, keep them distracted.
Or probably the confidence.
Or the confidence, and the confidence. Yeah, for sure. And so that's been a really transformational process for us. And I mean, just in the last few weeks, the kinds of spaces we've had to hold for young people that are affected with what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now, we couldn't have done that before. Safely, effectively, and being able to help them navigate the next step. So I think things like the Rise Up program are critical, and they also, just to say, like this panel, we're a cohort. You know, that's an incredible resource, and so how we are now able to mobilize and build smaller ecosystems that can, or consortiums of organizations that work together, I think that kind of investment represents real potential for growth, where you get what Anthony King was talking about, entire boroughs going, hey, we're going to do this together, and we're going to come up with a strategy. Or you get what's happening in Lambeth with the ecosystem Cold Harbour, which is connected to the MyEnds, you know, where you have numbers of youth organisations banding together with a common cause and also a common practice as well. So I think it's, for me, it's been indispensable, for sure.
Yeah, I think raising the status of youth work has been vital.
And
as well.
Sorry to interrupt you. I mean, you know, Craig Pinkney talks about this all of the time. Why do we accept? You know, in any other industry, I could not walk into an accountancy firm and have no skills in accountancy, but sit down and start messing with their spreadsheets. But we don't view youth workers in the same way. We need to. These are the people that are holding our young people when they're not being held anywhere else, and we're okay with not investing in them. So I think what Rise Up represents is a real a lighthouse for what is possible.
Good. And I'm going to come to Louisa now, if I can. Obviously, you're the programme manager. You've got a cohort now, and I'm assuming you provide networking opportunities. But what, I suppose, very briefly, what did you set out to achieve with this programme, and have you achieved it?
I think I joined the programme, and to be honest, having not known about it in January, so I've just seen the last year 3 come through. But exactly what Joseph was saying, kind of just for context, I'm 23 years experience in youth work. My whole career is youth work, and joining Rise Up, I'd just completed a master's JNC recognised qualification. Woo! And actually, with due respect to the stuff that I was learning at an institute, which was very hard for me to get into, which I had to self-fund myself, to then come here and to see the skills and training that on the ground that we're getting. What Joseph said is, typically, youth workers are the first people to get called in an emergency. But yet, 9 times out of 10, we're the unskilled, unqualified ones. And with due respect to the Boys Brigade of 1887, that has no impact in what my current role is doing and how I could then best support the current young people now, whereas the Rise Up programme definitely does that. It's bringing real life kind of training programmes that are current and effective to the youth workers who need it the most, because yes, quite correctly, we wouldn't be allowed in schools to just teach. We wouldn't be allowed to do social work without these qualifications, yet for some reason youth work's it's okay to do that. And I often say that the youth work is kind of like the poor cousin of this institute of working with young people. We are called upon, we are hardly invited into the meetings, and if we are, our voice isn't heard, but actually we are the ones, like Tanya said earlier, we're the ones that have probably one of the closest relationships with the young people. So the Rise Up programme setting out to be able to just build confidence and esteem in our youth workers, but also to give our youth workers a toolbox of how they can manage themselves, because similarly to the young people's traumas, we as practitioners are also absorbing these young people's traumas. And through the Rise Up programme, there was reflective practice, there was an opportunity for coaching, online counselling support to kind of relieve some of that pressure from the youth workers, because again, unfortunately, it's not funded. Youth workers will be on the front line, will have to, I've done it myself, and no doubt these guys have hugged the young people that have just lost their best friend through knife crime. We've absorbed that, but we've no outlet. The best I was offered, my colleague offered me a cup of tea. I mean, great, thanks. But that still sits with me and runs with me. So the Rise Up programme creates those networks and is enabling us to build confidence within the practitioners and share the knowledge, most importantly, to be able to kind of ripple that out to more practitioners. So most definitely has set out to do what it's done and has changed, and we've listened to the feedback over the 3 years. So what it looked like in year 1 to what it is now is quite different. But again, it's a very responsive way of being able to adapt to the needs of the practitioners in the current climates of what's going on in and around London.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I think that professionalism and recognising you are professionals.
Absolutely. it's the bit that
is important. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're slightly up against it in terms of time. We're going to bring us in at o'clock. Assembly Member Lord Bailey, you wanted to come in on the back of Joanne's question, but if you don't, you do. Absolutely go for it. And then Assembly Member Pigeon.
What I might do, Chair, is change my question because you don't have the time. I just want to quickly acknowledge something that Jade said about the seriousness of play. I come from a youth work background, 30 years of youth work. Actually, play went first. And you really challenged me to think about where I place play and the fact that youth violence, there is no serious or non-serious, because my experience has shown me that what we term as non-serious very really is the prelude to become serious. So that's very important. My question would be to our programme manager here, do we run the risk of raising the bar too high to enter youth work? Because I was a youth worker when you had to do the training, and it held out some people who had a natural affinity to it but didn't have the school experience for it. So how is Rise Up avoiding that? The other question I want to ask as well is, does Rise Up talk about, does it promote Britain? Does it promote community? Because I still do a lot of mentoring, and there's a definite feeling that people are talking down the country. And for young people who are refugees, who've made a very traumatic journey here, for young people who are not mainstream, the idea that Britain's a horrible place means that they have no future. So how is Rise Up affecting that conversation?
I'll take the first part. I think the thing with Rise Up, which is quite beautiful, is that apart from the only kind of to access Rise Up, basically you just have to be working with young people in either a paid or voluntary capacity. So it really removes any barriers to any kind of more formal education where you have to have a level 2 or 3. So the Rise Up programme is really aimed at a very kind of, it meets all abilities and mixed and that, so it kind of is an opportunity to be accessed by anybody who is doing youth work. So we've had some people who are volunteers doing youth work who were lucky enough to be able to come on it. One really good thing about the Rise Up programme was that we were able to offer a small backfill grant, which then supported some of the volunteers and part-time workers to access it. So there was some more discreet support behind, which allowed that. So I think we're probably all in agreement that there needs to be a standard of youth work, because we have got some people out there that are maybe doing more harm than good, but the Rise Up programme is definitely something that's open to all. That is what ideally we would love is for every practitioner to undergo it, because similar to you, when I started 20 years ago in local authority, I wasn't allowed out until I'd done my basic essentials to youth work, which was over a weekend. So there is definitely some need for standards along it, but I think the Rise Up definitely meets that by having very kind of flexible accessibility, and we've had kind of different educational needs and stuff, and our trainers work around that to make it as accessible as possible. And I think whilst there is some discussion around whether or not it should be accredited or not, one thing that leans for the purpose that it's not accredited means that those whose academic ability may not be of that ability means they can still access and still learn without the worry of the formal assessments, absolutely. And there is assessments obviously throughout, but they're less stressed. The second part, sorry, go back to the question, more about community and...
It's about, there's a definite feeling amongst some of the young people I work with now, TikTok's full of it, by the way, that Britain's a horrible place. And if you take this conversation we're having now, there's very few nations on the planet that would have this conversation. I've been a youth worker for 30 years. The rest of Europe simply doesn't do youth work. And are you, in your practice, I say to all of you, but particularly in Rise Up, are you talking about, yes, we have challenges, but this is, in my opinion, a very nice place, a very good place, Britain is. Are you having that conversation, or are you hearing young people talk about Britain in that negative way?
I mean, obviously, I wasn't fully in some of the discussions, so the practitioners may be a bit better placed to answer about the kind of discussions. I mean, just from my own personal experiences, yeah, you'll hear young people put Britain down, or it's run down, or it's like, it's rubbish, man, look at this, la la la. I suppose it's just, again, the informed practitioners' conversations that they're having about kind of looking at the positivity and kind of what opportunities there are here for us and or for them as well. So I suppose, again, it's the practitioners having the confidence to be able to challenge those thoughts and but also acknowledging and not being able to deny that young person's feeling, because again, if some of the young people that have arrived in our country have had these horrific, they're of course their attitude's going to be quite negative. So it's again that the blessing that practitioners have is that we can build the trust and the rapport with those young people to then really demonstrate that, look, that was one segment of your journey and or part of your time in the UK. And even for our British-born young people who've been through systems that may not have had most positive, we can build trust with us and allow us to demonstrate that actually there's more to this unfortunate part of your life, that you've had some unkind behaviour towards you. And I suppose even as adults, we have to kind of try and keep positive with what's going on in the world and how UK play in it. But it's ensuring that our practitioners have the confidence to be able to have those type of sometimes uncomfortable conversations.
I'd actually like to answer that a little bit. I think it's important to introduce nuance to the conversation and not talk about the UK or Britain in a kind of black and white way. So essentially, at least in my practice when I'm working with young people who they may have mixed feelings. It's not necessarily like black or white, UK's horrible, UK's amazing. A lot of the time it's a combination of validating a young person's experience and feelings, but also creating a space for nuance and introducing the reality that the fact that we even have a space that has so many different communities coming together, that live together, that can share their cultures, is a beautiful thing. essentially it's around introducing the idea that can be true, but at the same time there are some realities there as well. So it's really about having conversations that are nuanced and creating space for critical thinking, which combines a number of perspectives into that conversation ultimately. So that's kind of how at least I address that kind of rhetoric that Britain is bad, for example.
Thank you.
And Lord Welly,
if you don't mind me,
can I just come in one more, just a little bit also on that, just to say that with the young people, and especially the unaccompanied asylum seekers, because, you know, they have a different view of the UK, you know, when they actually get here. It's just to actually say that, you know, they have a conception, you know, from what they're told by the traffickers and all of that before they get here, all the services that they're going to get and be able to access. And when they get here and they're brought into care, let's say like my accommodation, they then realize that it's not exactly as they were told. Now, you know, what we do, we instill in them, you know, British values. We let them know how Britain works and let them know that it's a different culture. We get them united with their communities. And then that's when they actually start to settle down and realize, okay, there is something here. So I think that's one of the things that it's not whether Britain is good or bad, it's about what Britain can offer them. That's how they look at when they get here, what they can do. Now, when they go through the immigration process and if they're given the opportunity to go back to another country or stay here or do something, they are absolutely petrified if they're going to be sent back. So then they really start to realize Britain has a lot to offer me, but who's going to give it to me? And that's sort of like a question that we actually help them with, to let them know that there's a process in terms of services and all of that they've got to go through. So we educate them and help them to understand.
I just want to say, that's not me, Chair. I'm not guilty. Back to you, Chair. Back to you.
Thank you, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, and some people around this table have got a meeting that starts at 1 o'clock. It's actually 2 minutes past 1. I just want to thank you all so much. We've learnt a huge amount from you, particularly about the importance of valuing youth workers and developing youth workers. And I think that's something that we could well be making some recommendations about in our final report that comes out of this. So I just want to thank you all for everything that you've shared with us. I've got pages of notes written all over, scribbled all over my briefing. It was incredibly helpful to our investigation, and so thank you very much. I've just got a couple of things that I have to say at the end of the meeting formally to get us out of this room. So I would like to thank you for attending today and for your answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Noted. Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 23-24 Assembly year, and there's a group leads meeting next week to finalise things. Can we note the additional activity undertaken since our last meeting, which was the visit to Project Adder at Bethnal Green Police Station, for which we have huge thanks to the many Met officers who told us about their work, and also the drug workers and the people from the local authority, because that's something that's come up today, the importance of partnership working. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Wednesday the 8th of November at 10 o'clock in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Would you like to do a photo?